Chapter 16 of the Byzantine Empire. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Byzantine Empire, by Charles William Chadwick Oman. Chapter 16, The End of the Iconoclasts. A.D. 802 to 886. The iconoclastic controversy was far from being extinguished with the fall of the house of Leo the Isaurian. It was destined to continue in a milder form for more than half a century after the dethronement of Constantine VI. The lines on which it was fought out were still the same. The official hierarchy and the Asiatic provinces favored iconoclasm, the clergy and the European provinces were iconodules. See footnote. Hence it is interesting to note that through the greater part of the 9th century, while emperors of Eastern birth sat on the throne, the views of Leo the Isaurian were still in vogue, and that the eventual triumph of the image worshippers only came about when a royal house sprung from one of the European themes, the family of Basil the Macedonian, gained possession of the crown. Footnote: Slaves to images, a term of contempt not unfairly applied to the image worshippers. End footnote. The treasurer, Nicephorus, who overthrew Irene, and so easily obtained possession of the empire, was of Oriental extraction. His ancestor had been a Christian Arab prince, expelled from his country at the time of the rise of Mohammed, and his family had always dwelt in Asia Minor. Hence we are not surprised to find that Nicephorus was an iconoclast, and refused to follow in the steps of Irene in the direction of restoring image worship. He did not persecute the iconodules, as the Isaurians had done, but he gave them no personal encouragement. This being so, it is natural that we should find his character described in the blackest terms by the monkish chroniclers of the succeeding century. He was, we are told, a hypocrite, an oppressor, and a miser. But we cannot find any very distinct traces of the operation of such vices in his conduct during the 9 years of his reign. He was not, however, a very fortunate ruler; though he put down with ease several insurrections of discontented generals, he was unlucky with his foreign wars. The Caliph Harun al-Rashid did much harm to the Asiatic provinces, ravaging the whole country as far as Ancyra, nor could Nicephorus get rid of him without signing a rather ignominious peace, and paying a large war indemnity. A yet greater disaster concluded another war. Nicephorus invaded Bulgaria in 811, to punish King Crum for ravaging Thrace. The Byzantine army won a battle and sacked the palace and capital of the Bulgarian king; but a few days later Nicephorus allowed himself to be surprised by a night attack on his camp. In the panic and confusion the emperor fell, and his son and heir, Stauracius, was desperately wounded. The routed army did not stay its flight till Adrianople, and left the body of the emperor in the hands of the Bulgarians, who cut off his head, and made the skull into a drinking cup, just as the Lombards had dealt with the skull of King Cunimund 300 years before. Stauracius, the only son of Nicephorus, was proclaimed emperor, but it soon became evident that his wound was mortal, and Michael Rangaby, his brother-in-law, who had married the eldest daughter of Nicephorus, took his place on the throne before the breath was out of the dying emperor's body. Michael I was a weak, good-natured man, who owed his elevation to the mere chance of his marriage. He was a devoted servant and admirer of the monks, and began to undo the work of his father-in-law, and remove all iconoclasts from office. This provoked the wrath of that powerful party, and led to conspiracies against Michael, but he might have held his own if it had not been for the disgracefully incompetent way in which he conducted the Bulgarian war. He allowed an enemy whom the East Romans had hitherto despised, not only to ravage the open country in Thrace, but to storm the fortresses of Mesembria and Anchialus, and to push their invasions up to the gates of Constantinople. The discontent of the army found vent in a mutiny, and Leo the Armenian, an officer of merit and capacity, was proclaimed emperor in the camp. Michael I. made no resistance, and retired into a monastery after only 2 years of reign. 811–13. Leo the Armenian proved himself worthy of the confidence of the army. When the Bulgarians appeared in front of the walls of Constantinople they were repulsed, but Leo tarnished the glory of his success by a treacherous attempt to assassinate King Crum at a conference, a crime as unnecessary as it was unsuccessful, for the emperor might, as the event proved, have trusted to the sword instead of the dagger. In the next spring he took the offensive himself, marched out to Mesembria, and inflicted on the enemy such a sanguinary defeat that hardly a man escaped his sword, and Bulgaria was so weakened that it gave no further trouble for more than 50 years. Almost the moment that he was freed from the Bulgarian war, Leo became involved in the fatal iconoclastic controversy. Being a native of an Oriental theme, he was naturally imbued with the views of his great namesake, the Saracen, and inclined to reverse the policy of the monk-loving Michael I. But being moderate and wary he tried to introduce, without the use of force, a middle policy between image-breaking and image-worship—a fruitless attempt, which only brought him the nickname of the Chameleon. Leo's idea was the quaint device of permitting the use of images, but of hanging them so high from the ground that the public should not be able to touch or kiss them. This pleased nobody. On the one side, the patriarch and his monks inveighed against the moving of the images, while, on the other, tumultuous companies of Asiatic soldiery broke into churches and mutilated all the pictures and figures they could find. The 7 years of Leo's reign were full of ecclesiastical bickerings, but it should be remembered to his credit that no single person suffered death for his conscience' sake in the whole period. The most violent of the opponents of the emperor were merely interned in remote monasteries, when they ventured to set their will against his. Long ere the end of his reign, Leo had been compelled to leave his half-measures and prohibit all use of images. Like Constantine Copronymus, he called a council to endorse his action, and a majority of the Eastern bishops resolved that iconolatry was a dangerous heresy, and anathematized the patriarch Nicephorus and all other defenders of the images. Leo's reign was prosperous in all save the matter of his religious troubles. But he was not destined to die in peace in his bed. Michael the Amorian, the best general in the empire, was detected in a conspiracy against his master. Leo cast him into prison, but delayed his punishment, and left his accomplices at large. Michael had many friends in the palace who determined to strike a blow ere the emperor should have discovered their guilt. They resolved to slay Leo in his private chapel, as he attended matins on Christmas Day, for he was accustomed to come unarmed and unguarded to the early communion. Accordingly, the conspirators attended the service, and attacked the emperor in the midst of the Eucharistic hymn. Leo snatched the heavy metal cross off the altar and struck down some of his assailants, but numbers were too many for him, and he was cut down and slain at the very foot of the holy table. Christmas Day, 820. Michael the Amorian was dragged out of his dungeon, saluted as emperor, and crowned, even before the fetters were off his feet. It was not till the ceremony had been performed that time was found to send for a smith to strike away the rings. Michael was by birth a mere peasant, but had raised himself to high rank in the army by his courage and ability. He is sometimes styled the Amorian, from his birthplace, Amorium in Phrygia, but more often mentioned by his nickname of the Stammerer. He had been the friend and adviser of Leo the Armenian at the time of the latter's elevation to the throne, and his conspiracy must be reckoned a gross piece of ingratitude, even though we acknowledge that he was not personally responsible for his master's murder. Though rough and uncultured, Michael was a man of very considerable ability. He strengthened his title to the crown by a marriage with the last scion of the Isaurian house, the Princess Euphrosyne, daughter of the blind Constantine VI. The religious difficulties of the day he endeavoured to treat in an absolutely impartial way, so as to offend neither iconoclasts nor iconodules. He recalled from exile the image-worshipping monks whom Leo the Armenian had sent to distant monasteries, and proclaimed that for the future every subject of the empire should enjoy complete liberty of conscience on the disputed question. This was far from satisfying the image-worshippers, who wished Michael to restore their idols to their ancient places; but the Amorian would not consent to this, and obtained but a very qualified measure of approval from the monastic party. It was not to be expected that the reign of a military usurper, with no title to the throne whatever, would be untroubled by revolts. Michael had his share of such afflictions, and though he finally slew Thomas and Euphemius, the two pretenders who laid claim to his crown, yet by their means he lost two not inconsiderable provinces of his empire. While the rebellion of Thomas was in progress, an army of Saracens from Alexandria threw themselves on the island of Crete, and conquered it from end to end. When Michael's hands were free he sent two great armaments to expel the intruders, but both failed, and Crete was destined to remain for a whole century in Moslem hands. Its 100 harbours became the haunts of innumerable corsairs, who grew to be the bane of commerce in the Levant, and were a serious danger to the empire whenever its fleet fell into bad hands and failed to keep the police of the seas. A similar rising in Sicily under a rebel named Euphemius led to the invasion of that island by an army of Moors from Africa, who landed in 827, and maintained a foothold in spite of all efforts to expel them. At first their gains were not rapid, but in the time of Michael's successors they gradually won for themselves the whole of the island. After 9 years of reign the Amorian died a natural death, still wearing the crown he had won. It was just 50 years since any ruler of the empire had met such a peaceful end. He was succeeded by his son Theophilus, a vehement iconoclast, whose persecuting tendencies had been with difficulty restrained in his father's lifetime. His accession was the signal for a new campaign against image worship. He induced the patriarch John the Grammarian, a strong iconoclast like himself, to excommunicate as idolaters all who differed from him, and began to flog, banish, and imprison their leading men. His persecution would have been almost as vehement as that of Constantine Copronymus, but for the fact that he did not ever inflict the punishment of death. Branding and mutilation however he did not disdain. The iconodules saw the vengeance of Heaven for the misdeeds of Theophilus in the disasters which he suffered in war from the Saracens. He fell out with the Caliph Motassem, and in the first campaign took and burnt the town of Zapetra, for which the commander of the faithful had great regard. See footnote. This roused Motassem to furious wrath. He swore that he would destroy in revenge the town which Theophilus held most dear. He collected the largest Saracen army that had been seen since Moslemah beleaguered Constantinople in 717, and marched out of Tarsus with 130,000 men, each of whom, if legend speaks true, had the word Amorium painted on his shield. For it was Amorium, the birthplace of the emperor, and the home of his ancestors that Motassem had sworn to sack. while one division of the Caliph's army defeated Theophilus, who had taken the field in person, another headed by Motassem himself marched straight on Amorium, and took it after a brave defence of 55 days. 30,000 of its inhabitants were massacred, and the town was burnt, but the Caliph then turned home satisfied with his revenge, and the empire suffered nothing more from this most dangerous invasion. The Saracen war dragged on in an indecisive way, but no further disaster was encountered. Footnote: It is said to have been either his birthplace or that of his mother. End footnote. There are other things to be recorded of Theophilus beside his persecution of image worshippers and his war with the Caliph. He was long remembered for his taste for gorgeous display. Of all the East Roman emperors he seems to have delighted the most in gold and silver work, gems and embroidery. His golden plane tree was the talk of the East, and the golden lions at the foot of his throne, which rose and roared by the means of ingenious machinery within, were remembered for generations. Nor should the curious tale of his second marriage be left untold. When left a widower he bade the Empress Dowager Euphrosyne assemble at her levee all the most beautiful of the daughters of the East Roman aristocracy, and came among them to choose a wife, carrying like Paris a golden apple in his hand. His glance was first fixed on the fair Icasia, but approaching her he found no better topic to commence a conversation than the awkward statement that most of the evil had come into the world by means of women. The lady retorted that surely most of the good had also come into the world by their means, a reply which apparently discomposed Theophilus, for he walked on and without a further word gave the golden apple to Theodora, a rival beauty. The choice was hasty and unhappy, for Theodora was a devoted iconodule, and used all her influence against her husband's religious opinions. Theophilus died in 842, while still a young man, leaving the throne to his only son Michael, a child of 3 years, and the regency to the young empress. The moment that her husband's grave was closed Theodora set to work to undo his policy. Amid the applause of the monks and the populace of Constantinople she proclaimed the end of the persecution, sent for the banished image worshippers from their places of exile, and deposed John the Grammarian, the iconoclastic patriarch who had served Theophilus. Within 30 days of the commencement of the new reign the images had appeared once more on the walls of all the churches of Constantinople. The iconoclasts seem to have been taken by surprise, and made no resistance to the revolution. However, the empress did not take any measures to persecute them. It was only power and not security for life and limb that they lost. The sole permanent result of the long struggle which they had kept up was a curious compromise in the Eastern Church on the subject of representation of the human figure. Statues were never again erected in places of worship, but only paintings and mosaics. It was apparently believed that the actual image savoured too much of the heathen idol, but that no offence could possibly be given by the picture, which served as a pious remembrance of the holy personage it represented, but could be nothing more. Nevertheless the veneration of the Byzantines for their holy icons became almost as grotesque as idol worship, and led to many quaint and curious forms of superstition. Theodora, engrossed in things religious, handed over the education of her young son to her brother Bardas, who became her co-regent and was afterwards made Caesar. He brought up the young Michael in the most reckless and unconscientious manner, teaching him his own vices of drunkenness and debauchery. Michael was an apt pupil, and ere he reached the age of 21 had become a confirmed dipsomaniac. History knows him by the dishonourable nickname of Michael the Drunkard. Some years after his majority he grew discontented with his uncle, and slew him, in order that he might reign alone. His profligacy and intemperance became still more unbearable after Bardas was dead, and had it not been for the splendid organization of the Byzantine civil service the administration of the empire must have gone to pieces. Presently Michael grew tired of spending on state affairs any time that he could spare from his orgies, and appointed as Caesar and colleague his boon companion Basil the Macedonian. Basil had reached the position of Grand Chamberlain purely by the emperor's favour. He rose from the lowest ranks and is said to have first entered Michael's service in the humble position of a groom. His practical ability, combined with a head hard enough to withstand the effects of even the longest debauch, won Michael's admiration, and so he came to be first Chamberlain and then Caesar. Under the mask of a roisterer Basil concealed the most devouring ambition, and when he knew that his drunken benefactor had won the contempt of all the East Roman world, had the impudence and ingratitude to plan his murder. Michael was stabbed while sleeping off the effects of one of his orgies, and his low-born colleague seized the palace and proclaimed himself emperor. It might have been expected that the East Roman world would have refused to receive as its lord a man who owed his elevation to the freak of a drunkard, and had then become the assassin of his benefactor. But strangely enough Basil was destined to found the longest dynasty that ever sat upon the Constantinopolitan throne. He turned out a far better ruler than might have been expected from his disgraceful antecedents, being one of those fortunate men who are able to utilize the work of others when their own powers and knowledge fall short. Basil is mainly remembered for his codification of the laws of the empire, which superseded the Ecloga of Leo the Isaurian, even as Leo's compilation had superseded the more solid and thorough work of Justinian. The Basilica of Basil, with the additions made by his son Leo VI, formed the code of the Byzantine Empire down to its last days, no further rearrangement being ever made. Basil, being of European birth and not an Asiatic like the preceding emperors, was naturally an orthodox image worshipper. He showed his bigotry by a fierce persecution of the Paulicians, an Asiatic sect of heretics accused of Manichaeanism, whom the iconoclast emperors had been wont to tolerate. Basil's oppression drove many of them over the Saracen frontier, where they took refuge with the Moslems and maintained themselves by plundering the borders of the empire. Among the other transactions of his 19 years of reign, 867 to 886, the only one deserving notice is the final loss of Sicily. The Saracens of Africa, who had held a footing in the island ever since the time of Michael II, now finished their work by storming Syracuse in 878. End of chapter 16.
Chapter 17 of the Byzantine Empire. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Richard Carpenter. The Byzantine Empire by Charles William Chadwick Oman. Chapter 17. The Literary Emperors and Their Time. A.D. 886 to 963. The 80 years which followed the death of Basil the Macedonian were the most uneventful and monotonous in the whole history of the empire. They are entirely taken up by the 2 long reigns of Leo the Wise and Constantine Porphyrogenitus, the son and grandson of the founder of the dynasty. Basil had been a mere adventurer, an ignorant and uneducated but capable upstart. His successors, strange issue from such a stock, were a pair of mild, easy-going, and inoffensive men of literature. They wrote no annals with their sword, though the times were not unpropitious for military enterprise, but devoted themselves to the pen, and have left behind some of the most useful and interesting works in the Byzantine literature. If the times had been harder, it is doubtful whether Leo VI and Constantine VII would have been strong enough to protect their throne. But the period 880 to 960 was less troubled by foreign wars than any other corresponding period in the history of the East Roman state. The empire of the caliphs was breaking up in the east. The empire of Charles the Great had already broken up in the west. The Bulgarians and other neighbors of the realm on the north were being converted to Christianity and settling down into quiet. The only troubles to which the East Roman realm was exposed were piratical raids of the Russians on the north and of the Saracens of Africa on the south. These were vexatious, but not dangerous. An active and warlike emperor would probably have found the time propitious for conquest from his neighbors, but Leo and Constantine were quiet, unenterprising men, who dwelt contentedly in the palace, and seldom or never took the field. Leo's reign of 26 years was only diversified by an unfortunate invasion of Bulgaria, which failed through the mismanagement of the generals, and for a great raid of Saracen pirates on Thessalonica in 904. The capture of the second city of the empire by a fleet of African adventurers was an incident disgraceful to the administration of Leo, and caused much outcry and sensation. But it is fair to say that it was taken almost by surprise, and stormed from the side of the sea where no attack had been expected. The armies and fleet of the empire would have availed to rescue the town, if only its fall had been delayed a few weeks. When they had taken it, the Saracens fled with their booty, and made no attempt to hold its walls. Constantine Porphyrogenitus, the offspring of the fourth wife of Leo the Wise, and the child of his old age, was only 7 when his heritage fell to him. For many years he was under the tutelage of guardians. First, his father's brother Alexander ruled as his colleague, and became emperor regent. Some years after Alexander had died, an ambitious admiral named Romanus Lecapenus usurped the same position, declared himself emperor, and administered the realm. The life of Romanus was protracted into extreme old age, long after Constantine had reached his majority, but the ambitious veteran held tight to the scepter, and kept the rightful heir in the background. Constantine consoled himself by writing books and painting pictures. It was not till he was nearly 40 that he came to his own. Even then his success was not owing to his own energy. The sons of the aged Romanus had resolved to succeed their parent on the throne, in despite of the rights of Constantine. But when they declared themselves emperors, and made their old father abdicate, an outburst of popular wrath was provoked. The mob and the guards joined to sweep away the presumptuous Stephen Lecapenus and his brother. They were immured in monasteries, and Constantine emerged from his seclusion to administer the empire for 20 years. He was somewhat weak and ineffective, but neither obstinate nor tyrannical. Many abler men made worse rulers. The achievements of both Leo and Constantine were their books. Those of Leo consist of a manual on the art of war, some theological treatises, and a book of prophecies, a collection of political enigmas, which were long the puzzle and admiration of the East. The first named work is most valuable and interesting, bringing down the history of military organization, tactics, and strategy to Leo's own time, and giving us a perfect picture of the Byzantine army and its tactics, as well as incidental sketches of all the enemies with which it had to contend. The backbone of the force was still the themes or turmae of heavy cavalry, of which every province had one. The number of the provinces had been much increased since the days of the emperors of the house of Heraclius, and this implied a corresponding increase in the troops. They were raised from subjects of the empire and officered by Byzantine nobility, for, as Leo observed, there was no difficulty in obtaining officers of good birth and private means, whose origin made them respected by the soldiery, while their money enabled them to win the good graces of their men by many gifts of small creature comforts, over and above their pay. The names of some of the great noble houses are found for generation after generation in the imperial muster rolls, such as those of Ducas, Phocas, Comnenus, Bryennius, Circusus, Diogenes, and many more. The pages of Leo's work breathe an entire confidence in the power of the army to deal with any foe. Against Saracen, Turk, Hungarian, and Slav, instant and decisive action is advised. When caught, they should be fought and beaten. It is only when dealing with the men of the West, the Franks and the Lombards, that Leo recommends caution and deprecates any rash engagement in a general action, preferring to wear the enemy down by cutting off his supplies and harassing his marches. We gather a very favorable impression of the Byzantine army from Leo's book. It was organized, armed, and supplied in a manner that has no parallel to modern times. Each regiment possessed its special uniform and was equipped with regularity. There was none of that variety in arms and organizations which was the bane of medieval armies. The regiments had each attached to them an elaborate military train, a small body of engineers, and a provision of surgeons and ambulances. To encourage the saving of wounded men, Leo tells us that the bearer company was given a gold piece for every disabled soldier whom it brought off the field after a lost battle. It would be hard to find any similar care shown for the wounded till the days of our own century. The Byzantine fleet, as Leo describes it, had for its chief object the maintenance of the police of the seas in the Aegean, Levant, and South Italian waters. Its enemies were the Saracens of the Syrian and African coasts, and more especially the troublesome corsairs of Crete, who were often beaten but never subdued till Nicephorus Phocas exterminated them in 961. The empire maintained 3 fleets, small ones in the Black Sea and in the western waters, but the largest in the Aegean. This was composed of 60 dromons or war vessels of the largest rating. Their great depot was in the arsenal at Constantinople, but they could also be refitted at Samos, Thessalonica, and several other ports. Owing to their superior size and still more to their employment of the celebrated Greek fire, the imperial fleets generally had the better of the Saracen, but though they checked his larger squadrons, they could never suppress the petty piracy by isolated sea robbers which rendered all medieval commerce so dangerous. The works of Constantine Porphyrogenitus are even more interesting than those of his father. His treatise, called On the Themes, is invaluable to the historian, and it gives a complete list of all the themes, their boundaries, inhabitants, characteristics, and resources, with some other incidental notices of value. Still more important in this book, On the Administration of the Empire, which contains directions for the foreign policy of the realm, and sketches the condition and resources of the various nations with whom the Constantinopolitan government had dealings. Constantine also wrote a biography of his grandfather, Basil the Macedonian, couched in terms of respect which that hardy usurper was far from deserving. But his longest and most ambitious work was on court ceremonies, a manual of etiquette and precedence, describing the official hierarchy of the empire, its duties and privileges, and containing elaborate directions for the conduct of state ceremonials and the interior economy of the royal household. On this comparatively trifling topic, Constantine spent far more pains than on the works of larger interest which he composed. His books show him to have been a man of no great originative faculty, but gifted with the powers of a careful and methodical compiler, who loved details and never shirked trouble. His care for court pageants was very characteristic of the peaceful emperor, who had long been kept at home by his guardian and forced to compensate himself by ceremonial for want of real power. The fact that 2 successive emperors devoted themselves to literary work is a sufficient sign that by the end of the 9th century, the times of intellectual dearth and destitution which had so long prevailed were now at an end. From the death of Justinian to the end of the Heraclian dynasty, matters grew gradually worse. From the rise of Leo the Isaurian onward they began slowly to improve. The darkest age in Byzantine literary history was from about 600 to 750, a period in which we have hardly any contemporary annalists, no poetry save the lost Heracliad of George of Pisidia, and very little even of theology. Literature seemed absolutely dead at the accession of the Isaurians, but the quickening influence of the reforms of the great Leo seems to have been felt in that province as in every other. By the end of the 8th century, writers were far more numerous, though many of them were only anti-iconoclastic controversialists, like Theodore Studita. By the 9th century, we can trace the existence of a much larger literary class, and find a few really first-rate authors, such as the Patriarch Photius, 857 to 869, whose learning and width of culture was astonishing, and whose library catalogue is the envy of modern scholars. Perhaps the most interesting development of Byzantine literature were the epics or romances of chivalry, as we feel more inclined to call them, which were written towards the end of the times of the Macedonian dynasty. The epic of Diogenes Acritas, a work of the end of the 10th century, celebrating the praises of a hero who lived in the reign of Nicephorus Phocas and John Zimisces, 963 to 980, may serve as a type of the class. It tells of the adventures in love and war of Basil Diogenes Acritas, warden of the Sicilian marshes, or Clissurach of Taurus, as his official title would have run. He was a mighty hunter, both of bears and of Saracens, put down the Apolates or moss troopers, to use a modern analogy, who infested the border, and led many a foray into Syria. He is even credited with the slaying of an occasional dragon by his admiring bard. But perhaps the most interesting episode is the story of his elopement with the fair Eudocia Ducas, daughter of the general of the Cappadocian theme, whom he carried off in despite of her father and 7 brethren. Pursued by the irate family, he rode them down one by one at vantage points in the passes, but spared their lives, and was reconciled to them at the intercession of his bride. Diogenes Acritas is the best as well as the earliest of the class which it represents. Art followed much of the same course as literature in the period 600 to 900. It was in a state of decay for the first century and a half, and the surviving works of the time are often grotesquely rude. For sheer bad drawings and bad execution, nothing can be worse than a coin of Constans II or Constantine V. A Frankish or Visigothic piece could not be much more unsightly. The few manuscripts which survive from that period display a corresponding, though not an equally great, decline in art. Mosaic work, perhaps, showed less decline than other branches of the decoration, but even here 7th and 8th century work is very rare. In the 9th century everything improves wonderfully. It is almost astonishing to see how the old classical tradition of painting revive in the best manuscript illumination of the period. Many of them might have been executed in the 5th or even the 4th century, so closely do they reproduce the old Roman style. It seems that the iconoclastic controversy stimulated painting. Persecuted by the emperors, the art of the sacred portraiture became respected above all others by the multitude. Several of the most prominent iconodual martyrs were painters, of whom it is recorded that their works were no less beautiful than edifying. Those of Lazarus, whom the Emperor Theophilus tortured, are especially cited as triumphs of art as well as sanctity. Though a persecutor of painters, Theophilus deserves a word of mention as the first great builder since Justinian, and as a patron of the minor arts of jewelry, silverwork, and mosaic. There is good evidence that these were all in a very flourishing condition in his time, 829 to 842. There is one more point in the history of the empire in the 9th century to which attention must be called. This is the unique commercial importance of Constantinople during this and the 2 succeeding centuries. All other commerce than that of the empire had been swept off the seas by the Saracen pirates in the preceding 100 years, and the only touch between Eastern and Western Christendom was kept up under the protection of the imperial navy. The Eastern products which found their way to Italy or France were all passed through warehouses of the Bosporus. It was East Roman ships that carried all the trade, save a few Italian ports, such as Amalfi and the new city of Venice. No place seems even to have possessed merchant ships. This monopoly of the commerce of Europe was one of the greatest elements in the strength of the empire. So much money and goods passed through it that a rather harsh and unwise system of taxation did no permanent harm. End of chapter 17. Recording by Richard Carpenter in Seattle, Washington. Chapter 18 of the Byzantine Empire. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Richard Carpenter. The Byzantine Empire by Charles William Chadwick Oman. Chapter 18. Military Glory. While Constantine Porphyrogenitus had been dragging out the monotonous years of his long reign, events which completely changed the aspect of affairs in the Moslem East had been following each other in quick succession on the Asiatic frontier of his realm. Ever since it first came into existence, the Byzantine Empire had been faced in Asia by a single powerful enemy. First by the Sasanian kingdom of Persia, then by the Caliphate under the two dynasties of the Umayyads and of the Abbasides. Now, however, the Caliphate had at last broken up, and the descendants of Abdullah es Safa and Harun al-Rashid had become the vassals of a rebellious subject and preserved a mere nominal sovereignty, which did not extend beyond the walls of their palace in Baghdad. The crisis had come in 951 A.D., when the armies of the Buhawid prince Imaduddin, who had seized on the sovereignty of Persia, broke into Baghdad and made the caliph a prisoner in his own royal residence. For the future, the caliphs were no more than puppets, and the Buhawid rulers used their names as a mere form and pretense. But the conquerors did not gain possession of the whole of the caliphate. Only Persia and the lower Euphrates Valley obeyed them. Other dynasties rose and fought for the more western provinces of the old Moslem realm. The emirs of Aleppo and Mosul, who ruled respectively in North Syria and in Mesopotamia, became the immediate neighbors of the East Roman Empire, while the lands beyond them, Egypt and South Syria, formed the dominions of the house of the Ikshides. Thus the Byzantines found on their eastern frontier no longer one great centralized power, but the comparatively weak emirates of Aleppo and Mosul, with the Buhawid and Ikshidiite kingdoms in their rear. The four Moslem states were all new and precarious creations of the sword, and were generally at war with each other. An unparalleled opportunity had arrived for the empire to take its revenge on its ancient enemies and to move back the Mohammedan boundaries from along the line of the Taurus, where they had so long been fixed. Fortunately, it was not only the hour that had arrived, but also the man. The empire had at its disposal at this moment the best soldier that it had possessed since the death of Leo the Isaurian. Nicephorus Phocas was the head of one of those great landholding families of Asia Minor, who formed the flower of the Byzantine aristocracy. He owned broad lands in Cappadocia along the Mohammedan frontier. His father and grandfather before him had been distinguished officers, for the whole race lived by the sword, but Nicephorus far surpassed them. He was not only a practical soldier, but a military author. His book, The Oversight of War, dealing with the organizations of armies, still survives to testify to his capacity. It was on Nicephorus, then, that Romanus II., the son and heir of Constantine VII., fixed his choice when he resolved to commence an attack on the Mohammedan powers. The point selected for assault was the island of Crete, the dangerous haunt of corsairs which lay across the mouth of the Aegean, and sheltered the pestilent galleys that preyed on the trade of the empire with the West. Several expeditions against it had failed during the last half-century, but this one was fitted out on the largest scale. The vessels are said to have been numbered by the thousand, and the land force was chosen from the flower of the Asiatic themes. Complete success followed the arms of Nicephorus. He drove the Saracen into their chief town, Chadwick, Candia, stormed that city, and took an enormous booty, the hoarded wealth of a century of piracy. The whole island then submitted, and Nicephorus sailed back to Constantinople to present to his sovereign, in bonds, Kurup, the captive Emir of Crete, and the best of the booty of the island. 961 A.D. Nicephorus was duly honored for his feats of arms, and given command of an army destined to open a campaign in the next year against the great frontier strongholds of the Saracen in Asia Minor. Descending by the passes of central Taurus into Cilicia, Phocas stormed Antibaris and then forced Mount Amanus and marched into northern Syria. There he took the great town of Hierapolis and laid siege to Aleppo, the capital of the Emir Seyf-ud-Dawla, who ruled from Mount Lebanon to the Euphrates. The Emir was routed, the walls of his capital were stormed, and Aleppo, with all its wealth, fell into the hands of the Byzantine general. But the citadel still held out, and its protracted resistance gave time for the Moslems of South Syria and Mesopotamia to combine for the relief of their northern compatriots. So great an army appeared before the walls of Aleppo that Phocas determined not to risk a battle, and retreated with his booty and his numerous prisoners into the defiles of Taurus. 962 A.D. 60 captured forts and castles in Cilicia and northern Syria were the permanent fruits of his campaign. The next year Emperor Romanus II died, very unexpectedly, ere he had reached his 26th year. He left a young wife and 2 little boys, Basil aged 7 and Constantine, who was only 2. There followed the form of regency that custom had made usual. Nicephorus, the most powerful and popular subject of the empire, claimed the guardianship of the 2 young Caesars, and had himself crowned as their colleague. To secure his place, he married their mother, the young and beautiful Empress Dowager Theophano. The joint reign of Nicephorus Phocas and his wards, Basil II and Constantine VII, lasted 6 years, 963 to 969. The regent behaved with scrupulous loyalty to the young princes, and made no attempt to encroach on their rights or to supplant them by any of his numerous nephews, who had looked forward to his accession as likely to lead to their own promotion to imperial power. Nicephorus was an indefatigable soldier, and spent more of his reign in the field than in the palace. His end in life was to complete, as emperor, the conquest of Cilicia and North Syria, which he had commenced as general. The years 964 and 965 were spent in achieving the former object. 3 long sieges made him master of the great Sicilian frontier fortresses, Adana, Mopsuesta, and Tarsus. The rich bronze gates were sent as trophies to Constantinople, and set up again in the archways of the imperial palace. A few months later, the tale of victories was completed by the news that Cyprus also had fallen back into Byzantine hands after having passed 77 years in the power of the Saracens. For 2 years after this, Phocas was employed at home, where his administration was less popular than in the camp. The stern old soldier was not a friend of either priests or courtiers. He had several quarrels with the patriarch Polyeuctus, which made him detested by the clergy, and in his public life he displayed a dislike for pomp and ceremony, which led the Byzantine populace to style him a niggard and an extortioner. He suppressed shows and sports, and turned all the public revenues into the war budget, which lay nearest his heart. When he left the city in 968 for a new campaign against the Saracens, he was a much less popular ruler than when he had entered it in triumph in 966 after the conquest of Cilicia. In the camp, however, Nicephorus was as well loved and as successful as ever. His last Syrian expedition was no less glorious than his earlier campaign in the same quarter 6 years before. All the North Syrian cities fell into his hands: Emesa, Hierapolis, Laodicea, and with them Aleppo, the residence of the emir. Damascus bought off the invader by a great tribute. Only Antioch, the ancient capital of the land, held out, and Antioch also was taken in the winter by escalade, through the daring of an officer named Bertzes. The story of its fall is curious. The emperor had left a blockading army before it under a general named Peter, with orders not to risk an assault. Bertzes, the second in command, disobeyed orders and stormed a corner tower on a snowy night at the head of a small band of 300 men. Peter, in fear of the emperor's orders, refused to send him aid, and for more than 2 days Bertzes maintained himself unaided in the tower he had won. At last, however, the main body entered, and the Saracens fled from the town. Nicephorus dismissed both his generals from the service, Bertzes for having acted against orders, and Peter for having obeyed them too slavishly and allowing an important advantage to be imperiled. Nicephorus returned to Constantinople in the following year to meet his death at the hands of those who should have been his nearest and dearest. His wife, Theophano, had learnt to hate her grim and stern husband, who, though he possessed all the virtues, displayed none of the graces. She had cast her eyes in love on the emperor's favorite nephew, John Zimisces, a young cavalry officer, who had greatly distinguished himself in the Syrian war. Zimisces listened to her tempting, but he was not swayed by lust, but by ambition. He had hoped that his uncle would make him heir to the throne, to the detriment of the young Emperor Basil. The loyal old soldier had no idea of wronging his wards, and his nephew resolved to gain by murder what he could not gain by favor. So John and Theophano conspired against their best friend, and basely murdered him in the palace one December night in 969. The emperor was awakened from sleep to find a dozen of the assassins forcing his door. John threw him to the ground, and the others stabbed him, while he cried in his death agony, "O God, grant me thy mercy." Thus ended the brave and virtuous Nicephorus Phocas. His murderers succeeded in their end, for John Zimisces was able to seduce the guards, overawe the ministers, and force the patriarch to crown him emperor. He showed some contrition for the base slaughter of his uncle, giving away half his private fortune to found hospitals for lepers, and the other half to be distributed among the poor of the city. He did not wed the partner of his guilt, the Empress Theophano, but refused to see her face, and ultimately sent her to a monastery. If the manner of his accession could but be forgiven, John might pass for a favorable specimen of an emperor. He respected the rights of the young emperors Basil and Constantine as scrupulously as his uncle had done, and proved that as an administrator and a soldier he was not unworthy to sit in the seat of Phocas. But the nemesis of the murder of his uncle rested upon him in the shape of a long civil war. His cousin Bardas Phocas took arms to revenge the death of the old Nicephorus, and stirred up troubles among his Cappadocian countrymen for several years, till at last he was captured and immured in a monastery. The chief feat for which John Zimisces is remembered is his splendid victory over the Russians, whose great invasion of the Balkan Peninsula falls within the limits of his reign. We have not yet had much occasion to mention the Russian tribes, who for many centuries had been dwelling in obscurity and barbarism by the waters of the Dnieper and the Dona, in a land of forest and marsh far remote from the boundaries of the empire. Nor should we hear of them now, but for the fact that their scattered tribes had been of late unified into a single horde by a power from without, and urged forward into a career of conquest by a race of ambitious princes. Into the land of the Russians there had come some 100 years before the reign of John Zimisces, 862 A.D., a Viking band from Sweden, headed by Rurik, the ancestor of all the princes and czars of Russia. The descendant of these adventurers from the north had gradually conquered and subdued all the Slavonic tribes of the great forest land, and formed them into a single powerful kingdom. Its capital lay at Kiev on the Dnieper, and it had proved a formidable neighbor to all the barbarous tribes around. The Viking blood of the new Russian princes drove them seaward, and ere many generations had passed they had forced their way down the Dnieper into the Euxine, and begun to vex the northern boundaries of the Byzantine empires with raids and ravages like those which the Danes inflicted on Western Europe. Twice already within the 10th century had large fleets of light Russian rowboats, they were copies on a smaller scale of the Viking ships of the north, stolen down the Dnieper mouth to the shores of Thrace, and landed their plundering crews within a few miles of the Bosphorus, for a hurried raid on the rich suburban provinces. On the first occasion in 907, the Russians had returned home laden with plunder, but on the second, which fell in 941, the Byzantine fleet had caught them at sea, and revenged the harrying of Thrace by sinking scores of their light boats, which could not resist for a moment the impact of the heavy war galley urged by its 100 oars. But the attack which John Zimisces had to meet in 970 was far more formidable than either of those which had preceded it. Swiatoslav, king of the Russians, had come down the Dnieper with no less than 60,000 men, and had thrown himself onto the kingdom of Bulgaria, which was at the moment distracted by civil war. He conquered the whole country, and soon his marauders were crossing the Balkans and showing themselves in the plain of Thrace. They even sacked the considerable town of Philippopolis before the imperial troops came to its aid. This roused Zimisces, who had been absent in Asia Minor, and in the early spring of 971, an imperial army of 30,000 men set out to cross the Balkans and drive the Russians into the Danube. The struggle which ensued was one of the most desperate which East Roman history records. The Russians all fought on foot in great square columns, armed with spear and axe. They wore mail shirts and peaked helmets, just like the Normans of Western Europe, to whom their princes were akin. The shock of their columns was terrible, and their constancy in standing firm almost incredible. Against these warriors of the north, Zimisces led the mailed horsemen of the Asiatic themes, and the bowmen and slingers who were the flower of the Byzantine infantry. The tale of John's two great battles with the Russians at Prestolva and Silistria reads much like the tale of the battle of Hastings. In Bulgaria, as in Sussex, the sturdy axemen long beat off the desperate cavalry charges of their opponents, but they could not resist the hail of arrows to which they had no missile weapons to oppose, and when once the archers had thinned their ranks, the Byzantine cavalry burst in and made a fearful slaughter in the broken phalanx. More fortunate than Harold Godwinson at the field of Senlac, King Swiatoslav escaped with his life and the relics of his army. But he was beleaguered within the walls of Silistria, and forced to yield himself, on the terms that he and his men might take their way homeward, on swearing never to molest the empire again. The Russians swore the oath, and took a solemn farewell to Zimisces. The contrast between the two monarchs struck Leo the Deacon, a chronicler who seems to have been present at the scene, and caused him to describe the meeting with some vigor. We learn how the emperor, a small, alert, fair-haired man, sat on his great war horse by the river bank, in his golden armor, with his guards about him, while the burly Viking rode to meet him in a boat, clad in nothing but a white shirt, with a long moustache floating in the wind. They bade each other adieu, and the Russian departed, only to fall in battle ere the year was out, at the hands of the Patzinegs Tartars of the southern steppes. Soon after Swiatoslaf's death, the majority of the Russians became Christians, and ere long ceased to trouble the empire by their raids. They became faithful adherents of the Eastern Church, and drew their learning, their civilization, even their names and titles, from Constantinople. The Czars are but Caesars misspelt, and the list of their names, Michael, Alexander, Nicholas, John, Peter, Alexis, sufficiently witness to their Byzantine godparents. Russian mercenaries were ere long enlisted in the imperial army, and formed the nucleus of the Varangian Guard, in which at a later date Danes, English, and Norsemen of all sorts were incorporated. John Zimisces survived his great victory at Silistria for 5 years, and won, ere he died, more territory in northern Syria from the Saracens. The border which his uncle Nicephorus had pushed forward to Antioch and Aleppo was advanced by him as far as Amedia and Edessa in Mesopotamia. But in the midst of his conquests Zimisces was cut off by death, while still in the flower of his age. Report whispered that he had been poisoned by one of his ministers, whom he had threatened to displace, but the tale cannot be verified, and all that is certain is that John died after a short illness, leaving the throne to his young ward Basil II, who had now attained the age of 20 years, 976 A.D. End of chapter 18. Recording by Richard Carpenter in Seattle, Washington.
Chapter 19 of the Byzantine Empire by Charles William Chadwick Oman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 19 of the End of the Macedonian Dynasty. Basil II, who now sat in his own right on the throne, which his warlike guardians Nicephorus and John had so long protected, was by no means unworthy to succeed them. Unlike his ancestors of the Macedonian house, he showed from the first a love for war and adventure. Probably the deeds of John and Nicephorus excited him to emulation. At any rate, his long reign from 976 till 1025 is one continuous record of wars, and almost entirely of wars brought to a successful termination. Basil seemed to have modelled himself on the elder of his two guardians, the stern Nicephorus Phocas. His earliest years on the throne, indeed, were spent in the pursuit of pleasure, but ere he reached the age of 30, a sudden transformation was visible in him. He gave himself up entirely to war and religion. He took a vow of chastity, and always wore the garb of a monk under his armour and his imperial robes. His piety was exaggerated into bigotry and fanaticism, but it was undoubtedly real, though it did not keep him from the commission of many deeds of shocking cruelty in the course of his wars. His justice was equally renowned, and it often degenerated into mere harshness and indifference to suffering. No one could have been more unlike his gay, pleasure-loving father, or his mild literary grandfather, than the grim emperor who won from posterity the title of Bulgaroktonos, the slayer of the Bulgarians. Basil's life-work was the moving back of the East Roman border in the Balkan Peninsula as far as the Danube, a line which it had not touched since the Slavonic immigration in the days of Heraclius, 350 years before. In the first years of his reign, indeed, he accomplished little, being much harassed by two rebellions of great Asiatic nobles, Bardas Phocas, the nephew of Nicephorus II, and Bardas Skleros, the general of the Armeniac theme. But after Phocas had died and Skleros had surrendered, Basil reserved all his energies for war in Europe, paying comparatively little attention to the eastern conquests, which had engrossed Nicephorus Phocas and John Zimisces. The whole interior of the Balkan Peninsula formed at this period part of the dominions of the Samuel king of the Bulgarians, who reigned over Bulgaria, Servia, inland Macedonia, and other districts around them. It was a strong and compact kingdom, administered by an able man, who had won his way to the throne by sheer strength and ability, for the old royal house had ceased out of the land during Sviatoslav's invasion of Bulgaria 10 years before. The main power of Samuel lay not in the land between Balkan and Danube, which gave his kingdom its name, but in the Slavonic districts further west and south. The centre of his realm was the fortress of Ochrida, which he had chosen as his capital, a strong town situated on a lake among the Macedonian hills. There Samuel mustered his armies, and from thence he started forth to attack either Thessalonica or Adrianople, as the opportunity might come to him. The duel between Basil and Samuel lasted no less than 34 years, till the Bulgarian king died a beaten man in 1014. This long and unremitting struggle taxed all the energies of the empire, for Samuel was not a foe to be despised. He was no mere barbarian, but had learned the art of war from his Byzantine neighbours, and had especially studied fortification. It was the desperate defences of his numerous hill castles that made Basil's task such a long one. The details of the struggle are too long to follow out. Suffice it to say that after some defeats in his earlier years, Basil accomplished the conquest of Bulgaria proper, as far as the Danube in 1002, the year in which Widdin, the last of Samuel's strongholds in the north, surrendered to him. For 12 years more the enemy held out in the central Balkans, in his Macedonian strongholds, about Ochrida and Uskup. But at last Basil's constant victories in the field, and his relentless slaughter of captives after the day was won, broke the force of the Bulgarian king. In 1014 the emperor gained a crowning victory, after which he took 15,000 prisoners. He put out the eyes of all save one man in each 100, and sent the poor wretches with their guides to seek King Samuel in his capital. The old Bulgarian was so overcome at the horrible sight that he was seized with a fit and died on the spot of rage and grief. His successors, Gabriel and Ladislas, could make no head against the stern and relentless emperor, and in 1018 the last fortress of the kingdom of Ochrida surrendered at discretion. Contrary to his habit, Basil treated the vanquished foe with mildness, indulged in no massacres, and contented himself with repairing the old Roman roads and fortresses of the central Balkans, without attempting to exterminate the Slavonic tribes that had so often defied him. His conquests rounded off the empire on its northern frontier, and made it touch the Magyar kingdom of Hungary, for Servia no less than Bulgaria and Macedonia formed part of his conquests. Byzantine border now ran from Belgrade to the Danube mouth, a line which it was destined to preserve for nearly 200 years, till the great rebellion of Bulgaria against Isaac Angelus in the year 1086. Having justly earned his grim title of the Slayer of the Bulgarians by his long series of victories in Europe, Basil turned in his old age to continue the work of John Zimisces on the eastern frontier. There the Muslim states were still weak and divided, though a new power, the Fatimite dynasty in Egypt, had come to the front and acquired an ascendancy over its neighbours. Basil's last campaigns in 1021-2 were directed against the princes of Armenia and the Iberians and Abasgians who dwelt beyond them, to the north. His armies were entirely successful, and he added many Armenian districts to his eastern provinces, but it may be questioned whether these conquests were beneficial to the empire. A strong Armenian kingdom was a useful neighbour to the Byzantine realm. Being a Christian state, it was usually friendly to the empire, and acted as a barrier against Muslim attacks from Persia. Basil broke up the Armenian power, but did not annex the whole country, or establish in it any adequate provision against the ultimate danger of attacks from the east by the Mahometan powers. Basil died in 1025 at the age of 68, just as he was preparing to send forth an expedition to rescue Sicily from the hands of the Saracens. He had won more provinces for the empire than any general since the days of the great Belisarius, and at his death the Byzantine borders had reached the furthest extension which they ever knew. His successors were to be unworthy of his throne, and were destined to lose provinces with as constant regularity as he himself had shown in gaining them. There was to be no one after him who could boast that he had fought 30 campaigns in the open field, with harness on his back, and had never turned aside from any enterprise that he had ever taken in hand. Basil's brother Constantine had been his colleague in name all through the half-century of his reign. No one could have been more unlike the ascetic and indefatigable slayer of the Bulgarians. Constantine was a mere worldling, a man of pleasure, a votary of the table and the wine-cup, whose only redeeming tastes were a devotion to music and literature. He had dwelt in his corner of the palace, surrounded by a little court of eunuchs and flatterers, and excluded by the stern Basil from all share and lot in the administration of the empire. Now Constantine found himself the heir of his childless brother, and was forced at the age of 60 to take up the responsibilities of empire. He proved an idle and incompetent, but not an actively mischievous sovereign. His worst act was to hand over the administration of the chief offices of state to 6 of his old courtiers, all eunuchs, whose elevation was a cause of wild anger to the great noble families, and whose inexperience led to much weak and futile government during his short reign. Constantine died in 1028 after a very brief taste of empire. He was the last male of the Macedonian house, and left no heirs save his elderly unmarried daughters, whose education and moral training he had grossly neglected. Zoe, the eldest, was more than 40 years of age, but her father had never found her a husband. On his deathbed, however, he sent for a middle-aged noble named Romanus Argyrus, and forced him at an hour's notice to wed the princess. Only 2 days later Romanus found himself left, by his father-in-law's death, titular head of the empire. But Zoe, a clever, obstinate, and unscrupulous woman, kept the reins of authority in her own hands, and gave her unwilling spouse many an evil hour. She was inordinately vain, and pretended, like Queen Elizabeth of England, to be the mistress of all hearts long after she was well advanced in middle age. Her husband let her go her own way, and devoted himself to such affairs of state as he was allowed to manage. His interference with warlike matters was most unhappy. Venturing a campaign in Syria, he led his army to defeat, and saw several towns on the border fall into the hands of the Emir of Aleppo. After a reign of 6 years, Romanus died of a lingering disease, and Zoe was left a widow. Almost before the breath was out of her husband's body, the volatile empress, she was now over 50, had chosen and wedded another partner. The new emperor was Michael the Paphlagonian, a young courtier who had been gentleman of the bedchamber to Romanus, who was 28 years of age, and noted as the most handsome man in Constantinople. His good looks had won Zoe's fancy, and to his own surprise he found himself seated on a throne by his elderly admirer. The object of Zoe's anile affection was a capable man, and justified his rather humiliating elevation by good service to the empire. He beat back the Saracens from Syria, and put down the Bulgarian rebellion with success. But in his last years he saw Servia, one of the conquests of Basil II, burst out into revolt, and could not quell it. He also failed in a project to reconquer Sicily from the Moors, though he sent against the island George Maniakes, the best general of the day, who won many towns and defeated the Moslems in 2 pitched battles. The attempt to subdue the whole island failed, and the conquests of Maniakes were lost one after the other. Michael IV, though still a young man, was fearfully afflicted with epileptic fits, which sapped his health, and so enfeebled him that he died a hopeless invalid ere he reached the age of 36. The irrepressible Zoe, now again a widow, took a few days to decide whether she would adopt a son or marry a third husband. She first tried the former alternative, and crowned as a colleague her late spouse's nephew and namesake, Michael V. But the young man proved ungrateful, and strove to deprive the aged empress of the control of affairs. When he announced his intention of removing her from the capital, the city mob, who loved the Macedonian house and laughed at rather than reprobated the foibles of Zoe, took arms to defend their mistress. In a fierce fight between the rioters and the guards of Michael V, 3,000 lives were lost, but the insurgents had the upper hand, routed the soldiery, and caught and blinded Michael. Zoe, once more at the head of the state, now made her third marriage at the age of 62. She chose as her partner Constantine Monomachus, an old debauchee who had been her lover 30 years ago. Their joint reign was unhappy, both at home and abroad. Frequent rebellions broke out both in Asia Minor and in the Balkan Peninsula. The Patzinaks sent forays against the Danube, while a new enemy, the Normans of South Italy, conquered the theme of Langobardia, the last Byzantine possession to the west of the Adriatic, and established in its stead the Duchy of Apulia (1055). A still more dangerous foe began also to be heard of along the eastern frontier. The Seljuk Turks were now commencing a career of conquest in Persia and the lands on the Oxus. In 1048 the advance guard of their hordes began to ravage the Armenian frontier of the empire. But this danger was not yet a pressing one. When Zoe and Constantine IX were dead, the sole remaining scion of the Macedonian house was saluted as ruler of the empire. This was Theodora, the younger sister of Zoe, an old woman of 70, who had spent the best part of her days in a nunnery. She was as sour and ascetic as her sister had been vain and amorous, but she does not seem to have been the worst of the rulers of Byzantium, and her 2 years of power were not troubled by rebellions or vexed by foreign war. Her austere virtues won her some respect from the people, and the fact that she was the last of her house, and that with its extinction the troubles of a disputed succession were doomed to come upon the empire, seems to have sobered her subjects, and led them to let the last days of the Basilian dynasty pass away in peace. Theodora died on the 30th of August 1057, having on her deathbed declared that she adopted Michael Stratioticus as her successor. Then commenced the reign of trouble, the third anarchy in the history of the Byzantine Empire. End of recording.
Chapter 20 of The Byzantine Empire by Charles Oman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. I'm Drew Nelson. The Byzantine Empire by Charles Oman. Chapter 20. Manizikert, 1057 through 1081. The moment that the last of the Macedonian dynasty was gone, the elements of discord seemed unchained, and the double scourge of civil war and foreign invasion began to afflict the empire. In the 24 years between 1057 and 1081 were pressed more disasters than had been seen in any other period of East Roman history, save perhaps for the reign of Heraclius. For now came the second cutting short of the empire, the blow that was destined to shear away half its strength, and leave it maintained beyond any possibility of ultimate recovery. Domestic troubles were the first inevitable consequence of the extinction of the Macedonian dynasty. The aged Theodora had named as her successor on the throne Michael Stratioticus, a contemporary of her own who had been an able soldier 25 years back. But Michael VI was grown aged and incompetent, and the empire was full of ambitious generals who would not tolerate a dotard on the throne. Before a year had passed, a band of great Asiatic nobles entered into a conspiracy to overturn Michael and replace him by Isaac Comnenus, the chief of one of the ancient Cappadocian houses, and the most popular general of the East. Isaac Comnenus and his friends took arms and dispossessed the aged Michael of his throne with little difficulty, but a curse seemed to rest upon the usurpation. Isaac was stricken down by a disease when he had been little more than a year on the throne, and retired to a monastery to die. His crown was transferred to Constantine Ducas, another Cappadocian noble, who was supposed to be second only to Isaac in competence and popularity. Constantine reigned for 7 troubled years, and disappointed all his supporters, for he proved but a sorry administrator. His mind was set on nothing but finance, and in the endeavor to build up again the imperial treasure, which had been sorely wasted since the death of Basil II, he neglected all of the other departments of state. To save money, he disbanded no inconsiderable portion of the army, and cut down the pay of the rest. This was sheer madness, when there was impending over the empire the most terrible military danger that had been seen for 4 centuries. The safety of the realm was entirely in the hands of its well-paid and well-disciplined national army. and anything that impaired the efficiency of the army was fraught with the deadliest peril. The Seljuk Turks were now drawing near, pressing from the Oxus lands. Their hordes had overrun Persia and extinguished the dynasty of the Bulhawides. In 1050, they had penetrated to Baghdad, and their great chief Togrul Beg had declared himself defender of the faith and protector of the Caliph. Armenia had next been overrun, and those portions of it which had not been annexed to the empire and still obeyed independent princes had been conquered by 1064. In that year fell Ani, the ancient Armenian capital, and the bulwark which protected the Byzantine Empire from eastern invasions. The reign of Constantine Ducas was troubled by countless Seljuk invasions of the Armeniac, Anatolic, and Cappadocian themes. Sometimes the invaders were driven back, sometimes they eluded the imperial troops and escaped with their booty. But whether successful or unsuccessful, they displayed a reckless cruelty, far surpassing anything that the Saracens had ever shown. Wherever they passed, they not merely plundered to right and left, but slew off the whole population. Meanwhile, Constantine X, with his reduced army, proved incompetent to hold them back, all the more so that his operations were distracted by an invasion of the Uzis, a Tartar tribe from the Euxine shore, who had burst into Bulgaria. Ducas died in 1067, leaving the throne to his son Michael, a boy of 14 years. The usual result followed. To secure her son's life and throne, the Empress Dowager Eudocia took a new husband and made him guardian of the young Michael. The new emperor regent was Romanus Diogenes, an Asiatic noble, whose brilliant courage displayed in the Seljuk wars had dazzled the world, and caused it to forget that caution and ability are far more regal virtues than headlong valor. Romanus took in hand with the greatest of vigor the task of repelling the Turks, which his predecessors had so grievously neglected. He led into the field every man that could be collected from the European or Asiatic themes, and for 3 successive years was incessantly marching and counter-marching in Armenia, Cappadocia, and Syria, in the endeavor to hunt down the marauding bands of the Seljuks. The operations of Romanus were not entirely unsuccessful. Alp Arslan, the Sultan of the Seljuks, contented himself at first with dispersing his hordes in scattered bands and attacking many points of the frontier at once. Hence, the emperor was not unfrequently able to catch and slay off one of the minor divisions of the Turkish army. But some of them always contrived to elude him. His heavy cavalry could not come up with the light Seljuk horse bowmen, who generally escaped and rode back home by a long detour, burning and murdering as they went. Cappadocia was already desolated from end to end, and the Turkish raids had reached as far as Amorium in Phrygia. In 1071 came the final disaster. In pursuing the Seljuk plunderers, Romanus was drawn far eastward to Manzikert on the Armenian frontier. There he found himself confronted, not by a flying foe, but by the whole force of the Seljuk Sultanate, with the Alp Arslan himself at its head. Though his army was harassed by long marches, and though 2 large divisions were absent, the emperor was eager to fight. The Turks had never before offered him a fair field, and he relied implicitly on the power of his cuirassiers to ride down any number, however great, of the light Turkish horse. The decisive battle of Manzikert, which is not too much to call the turning point of the whole course of Byzantine history, was fought in the early summer of 1071. For a long day the Byzantine horsemen continued to roll back and break through the lines of Turkish horse bowmen. But fresh hordes kept coming on, and in the evening the fight was still undecided. As the night was approaching, Romanus prepared to draw his troops back to the camp. But an unhappy misconception of orders broke up the line, and the Seljuks edged in between the 2 halves of the army. Either from treachery or cowardice, Andronicus Ducas, the officer who commanded the reserve, led his men off without fighting. The emperor's division was beset on all sides by the enemy, and broke up in the dusk. Romanus himself was wounded, thrown from his horse, and made prisoner. The greater part of his men were cut to pieces. Alp Arslan showed himself more forbearing to his prisoner than might have been expected. It is true that Romanus was led after his capture to the tent of the Sultan and laid prostrate before him, that after the Turkish custom the conqueror might place his foot on the neck of his vanquished foe. But after this humiliating ceremony the emperor was treated with kindness, and allowed after some months to ransom himself and return home. He would have fared better, however, if he had remained the prisoner of the Turk. During his captivity, the conduct of affairs had fallen into the hands of John Ducas, uncle of the young Emperor Michael. The unscrupulous regent was determined that Romanus should not supersede him and mount the throne again. When the released captive reappeared, John had him seized and blinded. The cruel work was so roughly done that the unfortunate Romanus died a few days later. After this fearful disaster, Asia Minor was lost. There was no chief to take the place of Romanus, and the Seljuk hordes spread westward, almost unopposed. The next 10 years were a time of chaos and disaster. While the Seljuks were carving their way deeper and deeper into the vitals of the empire, the wrecks of the Byzantine army were employed not in resisting them, but in carrying on a desperate series of civil wars. After the death of Romanus, every general in the empire seemed to think that the time had come for him to assume the purple buskins and proclaim himself emperor. History records the names of no less than 6 pretenders to the throne during the next 9 years, besides several rebels who took up arms without assuming the imperial title. The young emperor Michael Ducas proved, when he came of age, to be a vicious non-entity. He is remembered in Byzantine history only by his nickname of Peripinakis, the peck filcher, given him because in a year of famine he sold the measure of wheat to his subjects a fourth short of its proper contents. His name and that of Nicephorus Botaniates, the rebel who overthrew him, cover in the list of emperors a space of 10 years that would better be represented by a blank, for the authority of the nominal ruler scarcely extended beyond the walls of the capital, and the themes that were not overrun by the Turks were in the hands of governors who each did what was right in his own eyes. At last a man of ability worked himself up to the surface. This was Alexius Comnenus, nephew of the Emperor Isaac Comnenus, whose short reign we related in the opening paragraph of this chapter. Alexius was a man of courage and ability, but he displayed one of the worst types of Byzantine character. Indeed, he was the first emperor to whom the epithet Byzantine, in its common use and opprobrious sense, could be applied. He was the most accomplished liar of his age, and, while winning and defending the imperial throne, committed enough acts of mean treachery and swore enough false oaths to startle even the courtiers of Constantinople. He could fight when necessary, but he preferred to win by treason and perjury. Yet, as a ruler, he had many virtues, and it will always be remembered to his credit that he dragged the empire out of the deepest slough of degradation and ruin that it had ever sunk into. Though false, he was not cruel, and 7 ex-emperors and usurpers living unharmed in Constantinople under his scepter bore witness to the mildness of his rule. The tale of his reign sufficiently bears witness to the strange mixture of moral obliquity and practical ability in his character. End of chapter 20. I'm Drew Nelson in Atlanta, Georgia. Recording in November 2012.
Chapter 21. of the Byzantine Empire by Charles William Chadwick Oman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 21. Comneni and the Crusades. Alexius Comnenus found himself, in 1081, placed in a position almost as difficult and perilous as that which Leo the Isaurian faced in 716. Like Leo, he was a usurper without prestige or hereditary claims, seated on an unsteady throne, and forced to face imminent danger from the Muslim enemy without, and from rival adventurers within. It may be added that the Isaurian, grievously threatened as he was by the enemy from the east, had no peril impending from the west. Alexius had to face at one and the same time the assault of the Seljuks on Asia Minor, and the attack of a new and formidable foe in his western provinces. We have already mentioned the manner in which the Byzantine dominion in Italy had come to an end. Now the same Norman adventurers who had stripped the empire of Calabria and Apulia were preparing to cross the Straits of Otranto and seek out the emperor in the central provinces of his realm. The forces of the Italian and Sicilian Normans were united under their great chief Robert Guiscard, the hardy and unscrupulous Duke of Apulia. Just 10 years before, he had captured Bari, the last Byzantine fortress on his own side of the straits. Now he was resolved to take advantage of the anarchy which had prevailed in the empire ever since the day of Manzikert, and to build up new Norman principalities to the east of the Adriatic. There seemed to be nothing presumptuous in the scheme to those who remembered how a few hundred Norman adventurers had conquered all southern Italy and Sicily, and swelled into a victorious army 50,000 strong. Nor could the invaders fail to remember how, but 15 years before, another Norman duke had crossed another strait in the far west, and won by his strong right hand the great kingdom of England. Alexius Comnenus sat like Harold Godwinson on a lately acquired and unsteady throne, and Duke Robert thought to deal with him much as Duke William had dealt with the Englishmen. In June 1081 the Normans landed, 30,000 strong, and laid siege to Durazzo, the maritime fortress that guarded the Epirot coast. The emperor at once flew to its succour. Always active, hopeful, and versatile, he trusted that he might be able to beat off the new invaders, whose military worth he was far from appreciating at its true value. He patched up a hasty pacification with Suleiman, Sultan of the Seljuks, by surrendering to him all the territory of which the Turk was in actual possession, a tract which now extended as far as the waters of the Propontis, and actually included the city of Nicaea, close to the Bithynian shore, and only 70 miles from Constantinople. The army with which Alexius had to face the Normans was the mere wreck and shadow of that which Romanus IV had led against the Turks 10 years before. The military organization of the empire had gone to pieces, and we no longer hear of the old themes of heavy cavalry which had formed its backbone. The new army contained quite a small proportion of national troops. Its core was the Imperial Guard of Varangians, Russian, Danish, and English mercenaries whose courage had won the confidence of so many emperors. With them marched many Turkish, Frankish, Servian, and South Slavonic auxiliaries. The native element comprised the regulars of the 3 provinces of Thrace, Macedonia, and Thessaly, all that now remained in Alexius's hands of the ancient East Roman realm. Alexius brought Robert Guiscard to battle in front of Durazzo and suffered a crushing defeat at his hands. The emperor's bad tactics were the main cause of his failure. His army came upon the ground in successive detachments, and the van was cut to pieces before the main body had reached the field. The brunt of the battle was borne by the Varangians. Carried away by their fiery courage, they charged the Normans before the rest of Alexius's troops had formed their line of battle. Rushing on the wing of Robert's army, commanded by the Count of Bari, they drove it horse and foot into the sea. Their success, however, disordered their ranks, and the Norman duke was able to turn his whole force against them ere the emperor was near enough to give them aid. A fierce cavalry charge cut off the greater part of the Varangians. The rest collected on a mound by the sea shore, and for some time beat off the Normans with their axes, as King Harold's men had done at Senlac on the last occasion when English and Norman had met. But Robert shot them down with his archers, and then sent more cavalry against them. They fell, save a small remnant who defended themselves in a ruined chapel, which Guiscard had finally to burn before he could make any end of its obstinate defenders. The rest of Alexius's army only came into action when the Varangians had been destroyed. It was cowed by the loss of its best corps, fought badly, and fled in haste. Alexius himself, who lingered last upon the field, was surrounded and only escaped by the speed of his horse and the strength of his sword arm. Durazzo fell, and in the next year the Normans overran all Epirus and descended into Thessaly. Alexius risked 2 more engagements with them, but his inexperienced troops were defeated in both. Disaster taught him to avoid pitched battles, and at last in 1083, after a more cautious campaign, his patience was rewarded by the dispersion of the Norman army. Catching it while divided, the emperor inflicted on it a severe defeat at Larissa, and forced it back into Epirus. After this the war slackened, and when Robert Guiscard died in 1085, the Norman danger passed away. Thus one foe was removed, but Alexius was not destined to win peace. Constant rebellions at home and wars with the Patzinaks, the Slavs, and the Seljuks filled the next 10 years. Alexius, however, was never discouraged. Eking out the lion's skin with the fox's hide, he fought and intrigued, lied and negotiated, and at the end of the time had held his own and lost no more territory, while his throne was growing more secure. But in the 15th year of his reign a new cloud began to arise in the west, which was destined to exercise unsuspected influence, both for good and evil, on the empire. The Crusades were on the eve of their commencement. Ever since the Seljuks had taken Jerusalem in 1075, 4 years after Manzikert, the western pilgrims to the Holy Land had been suffering grievous things at the hands of the barbarians. But all the wrath that their ill treatment provoked would have been fruitless if the way to Syria had not been opened of late to the nations of Western Christendom. 2 series of events had made free communication between East and West possible in the end of the 11th century, in a measure which had never before been seen. The first of these was the conversion of Hungary, begun by St. Stephen in 1000 and completed about 1050. For the future there lay between the Byzantine Empire and Germany not a barbarous pagan state, but a semi-civilized Christian kingdom, which had taken its place among the other nations of the Roman Catholic faith. Communication down the Danube between Vienna and the Byzantine outposts in Bulgaria became for the first time possible, and ere long the route grew popular. The second phenomenon which made the Crusades possible was the destruction of the Saracen naval power in the central Mediterranean. This was carried out first by the Pisans and Genoese, whose fleets conquered Corsica and Sardinia from the Moslems, and then by the Normans, whose occupation of Sicily made the voyage from Marseilles and Genoa to the east safe and sure. 4 new maritime powers, the Genoese, Pisans, and Normans in the open sea, and the Venetians in the Adriatic, had developed themselves into importance, and now their fleets swept the waters where no Christian war galleys save those of Byzantium had ever been seen before. It was the fact that free access to the east was now to be gained, both by land and sea, as it had never been before, that made the Crusades feasible. Of the preaching of Peter the Hermit and the efforts of Pope Urban we need not speak. Suffice it to say that in 1095 news came to the Emperor Alexius that the nations of the West were mustering by myriads and directing their march towards his frontiers with the expressed intention of driving the Moslems from Palestine. The Emperor had little confidence in the purity of the zeal of the Crusaders. His wily mind could not comprehend their enthusiasm, and he dreaded that some unforeseen circumstance might turn their arms against him. When the hordes of armed Frankish pilgrims began to arrive, his fears were justified. The newcomers pillaged his country right and left upon their way, and were drawn into many bloody fights with the peasantry and the imperial garrisons, which might have ended in open war. But Alexius set himself to work to smooth matters down. All his tact and patience were needed, and there was ample scope for his talent for intrigue and insincere diplomacy. He had resolved to induce the Crusadan chiefs to do him homage, and to swear to restore to him all the old dominions of the empire which they might reconquer from the Turks. After long and tedious negotiations he had his way. The leaders of the Crusade, from Godfrey of Bouillon and Hugh of Vermandois down to the smallest barons, were induced to swear him allegiance. Some he flattered, others he bribed, others he strove to frighten into compliance. The pages of the history written by his daughter Anna Comnena, who regarded his powers of cajolery with greater respect than any other part of his character, are full of tales of the ingenious shifts by which he brought the stupid and arrogant Franks to reason. At length they went on their way, with Alexius's gold in their pockets, and encouraged by his promise that he would aid them with his troops, continued to supply them with provisions, and never abandon them till the Holy City was reconquered. By the spring of 1097 the Crusaders began to cross the Bosphorus, and in 2 marches found themselves within Turkish territory. They at once laid siege to Nicaea, the frontier fortress of the Seljuk Sultan. Encompassed by so great a host, the Turkish garrison soon lost heart and surrendered, not to the Franks, but to Alexius, whose troops they secretly admitted within the walls. This nearly led to strife between the Emperor and the Crusaders, who had been reckoning on the plunder of the town, but Alexius appeased them with further stores of money, and the pilgrim host rolled forward once more into the interior of Asia Minor. In 1097 the Crusaders forced their way through Phrygia and Cappadocia, beating back the Seljuks at every encounter, till they reached North Syria, where they laid siege to Antioch. Alexius had undertaken to help them in their campaign, but he was set on playing an easier game. When they were crushing the Turks, he followed in the rear at a safe distance, like the jackal behind the lion, picking up the spoil which they left. While the Sultan was engaged with them, Alexius despoiled him of Smyrna, Ephesus, and Sardis, reconquering western Asia Minor almost without a blow, since the Seljuk hordes were drawn away eastward. It was the same in the next year, when the Crusaders were fighting hard round Antioch against the princes of Mesopotamia, and sent to ask for instant help. Alexius dispatched no troops to Syria, but gathered in a number of Lydian and Phrygian fortresses which lay nearer to his hand. Hence there resulted a bitter quarrel between the Emperor and the Franks, for since he gave them no help, they refused to hand over to him Antioch and the other Syrian conquests. Each party, in fact, broke the compact signed at Constantinople and accused the other of treachery. Hence it resulted that the crusade ended not in the re-establishment of the Byzantine power in Syria, but in the foundation of the new Frankish states, the principalities of Edessa, Antioch, and Tripoli, and the more important kingdom of Jerusalem. That he did not recover Syria was no real loss to Alexius. He would not have been strong enough to hold it, had it been handed over to him. The actual profit which he made by the crusade was enough to content him. The Franks had rolled back the Turkish frontier in Asia not less than 200 miles. Instead of the Seljuk lying at Nicaea, he was now chased back behind the Bithynian hills, and the empire had recovered all Lydia and Caria, with much of the Phrygian inland. The Seljuks were hard hit, and for well nigh a century were reduced to fight on the defensive. Owing, then, to the fearful blow inflicted by the Crusades on the Moslem powers of Asia Minor and Syria, the later years of Alexius were free from the danger which had overshadowed the beginning of his reign. He was able, between 1100 and 1118, to strengthen his position at home and abroad. Constant rebellions which had vexed his early years ceased, and when the Normans under Bohemond of Tarentum tried to repeat in 1107 the feats which Robert Guiscard had accomplished in 1082, they were beaten off with ease and forced to conclude a disadvantageous peace. The reign of Alexius might have been counted a period of success and prosperity, if it had not been for 2 considerations. The first was the rapid decline of Constantinople as a commercial centre, which was brought about by the Crusades. When the Genoese and Venetians succeeded in establishing themselves in the seaports of Syria, they began to visit Constantinople far less than before. It paid them much better to conduct their business at Acre or Tyre than on the Bosphorus. The King of Jerusalem, the weakest of feudal sovereigns, could be more easily bullied and defrauded than the powerful ruler of Constantinople. In his own seaports he possessed hardly a shadow of authority. The Italians traded there on such conditions as they chose. Hence the commerce of the West with Persia, Egypt, Syria, and India ceased to pass through the Bosphorus. Genoa and Venice became the marts at which France, Italy, and Germany sought their eastern goods. It is probable that the trade of Constantinople fell off by a third or even a half in the 50 years that followed the First Crusade. The effect of this decline on the coffers of the state was deplorable, for it was ultimately on its commercial wealth that the Byzantine state based its prosperity. All through the reigns of Alexius and his two successors, the complaints about the rapid fall in the imperial revenue grew more and more noticeable. This dangerous decay in the finances of the empire was rendered still more fatal by the political devices of Alexius, who began to bestow excessive commercial privileges to the Italian republics in return for their aid in war. This system commenced in 1081, when the emperor, then in the full stress of his first Norman war, granted the Venetians the free access to most of the ports of his empire, without the payment of any customs dues. To give to foreigners a boon denied to his own subjects was the height of economic lunacy. The native merchants complained that the Venetians were enabled to undersell them in every market, owing to this exemption from import and export duties. Matters were made yet worse in 1111, when Alexius bestowed a similar, though less extensive, grant of immunities on the Pisans. When John II, the son of Alexius, succeeded in 1118 to the empire which his father had saved, the fabric was less strong than it appeared to the outward eye. Territorial extension seemed to imply increased strength, and the rapid falling off in the financial resources of the realm attracted little attention. John, however, was one of those prudent and economical princes who stave off for years the inevitable day of distress. Of all the rulers who ever sat upon the Byzantine throne, he is the only one of whom no detractor has ever said an evil word. When we remember that he was his father's son, it is astonishing to find that his honesty and good faith were no less notable than his courage and generosity. His subjects named him John the Good, and their appreciation of his virtues was sufficiently marked by the fact that no single rebellion marred the internal peace of his long reign, 1118 to 1143. John was a good soldier, and during his rule the frontier of the empire in Asia continued to advance at the expense of the Turks. But his strategy would seem to have been at fault, since he preferred to reconquer the coast districts of northern and southern Asia Minor rather than to strike at the heart of the Seljuk power on the central tableland. When he had reduced all Cilicia, Pisidia, and Pontus, his dominions became a narrow fringe of coast, surrounding on three sides the realm of the Sultan, who still retained all the Cappadocian and Lycaonian plateau. It should then have been John's task to finish the reconquest of Asia Minor, but he preferred to plunge into Syria, where he forced the Frank Prince of Antioch and the Turkish Emir of Aleppo to pay him tribute, but left no permanent monument of his conquests. He was preparing a formidable expedition against the Franks of the Kingdom of Jerusalem when he perished by accident while on a hunting expedition. John the Good was succeeded by his son Manuel, whose strength and weakness combined to give a death blow to the empire. Manuel was a mere knight-errant who loved fighting for fighting's sake, and allowed his passion for excitement and adventure to be his only guide. His whole reign was one long series of wars, entered into and abandoned with equal levity. Yet for the most part they were successful wars, for Manuel was a good cavalry officer if he was but a reckless statesman, and his fiery courage and untiring energy made him the idol of his troops. At the head of the veteran squadrons of mercenary horsemen that formed the backbone of his army, he swept off the field every enemy that ever dared to face him. He overran Servia, invaded Hungary, to whose king he dictated terms of peace, and beat off with success an invasion of Greece by the Normans of Sicily. His most desperate struggle, however, was a naval war with Venice, in which his fleet was successful enough and drove the Doge and his galleys out of the Aegean. But the damage done to the trade of Constantinople by the Venetian privateers, who swarmed in the Levant after their main fleet had been chased away, was so appalling that the emperor concluded peace in 1174, restoring to the enemy all the disastrous commercial privileges which his grandfather Alexius had granted them 8 years before. The main fault of Manuel's wars was that they were conducted in the most reckless disregard of all financial considerations. With a realm which was slowly growing poorer, and with a constantly dwindling revenue, he persisted in piling war on war, and on devoting every bezant that could be screwed out of his subjects to the support of the army alone. The civil service fell into grave disorder, the administration of justice was impaired, roads and bridges went to decay, docks and harbours were neglected, while the money which should have supported them was wasted on unprofitable expeditions to Egypt, Syria, or Italy. So long as the ranks of his mercenaries were full and their pay forthcoming, the emperor cared not how his realm might fare. of all Manuel's wars, only one went ill, but that was the most important of them all, the one necessary struggle to which he should have devoted all his energies. This was the contest with the Seljouks, which ended in 1176 by a disastrous defeat at Myriokephalon in Phrygia, brought about by the inexcusable carelessness of Manuel himself, who allowed his army to be caught in a defile from which there was no exit, and routed piecemeal by an enemy who could have made no stand on the open plains. Manuel then made peace and left the Seljouks alone for the rest of his reign. In 1180 Manuel died, and with him died the good fortune of the house of Comnenus. His son and heir, Alexius, was a boy of 13, and the inevitable contest for the regency, which always accompanied a minority, ensued. After 2 troubled years, Andronicus Comnenus, a first cousin of the Emperor Emmanuel, was proclaimed Caesar, and took over the guardianship of the young Alexius. Andronicus was an unscrupulous ruffian, whose past life should have been sufficient warning against putting any trust in his professions. He had once attempted to assassinate Manuel, and twice deserted to the Turks, but he was a consummate hypocrite, and won his way to the throne by professions of piety and austere virtue. No sooner was he seated by the side of Alexius II, and felt himself secure, than he seized and strangled his young relative. But, like our own Richard III, Andronicus found that the moment of his accession to sole power was the moment of the commencement of his troubles. Rebels rose in arms all over the empire to avenge the murdered Alexius, and the Normans of Sicily seized the opportunity of invading Macedonia. Conspiracies were rife in the capital, and the executions which followed their detection were so numerous and bloody that a perfect reign of terror set in. The emperor plunged into the most reckless cruelty till men almost began to believe that his mind was affected. Ere long the end came. An inoffensive nobleman named Isaac Angelus, being accused of treason, was arrested at his own door by the emissaries of the tyrant. Instead of surrendering himself, Isaac drew his sword and cut down the official who laid hand on him. A mob came to his aid and met no immediate opposition, for Andronicus was absent from the capital. The mob swelled into a multitude, the guards would not fight, and when the emperor returned in haste, he was seized and torn to pieces, without a sword being drawn in his cause. Isaac Angelus reigned in his stead. End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22 of the Byzantine Empire. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Byzantine Empire, by Charles William Chadwick Oman. Chapter 22. The Latin Conquest of Constantinople. The state which had been drained of its resources by the energetic but wasteful Manuel, and disorganized by the rash and wicked Andronicus, now passed into the hands of the 2 most feeble and despicable creatures who ever sat upon the imperial throne, the brothers Isaac and Alexius Angelus, whose reigns cover the years 1185 to 1204. Among all the periods which we have hitherto described in the tale of the East Roman Empire, that covered by the reign of the 2 wretched Angeli may be pronounced the most shameful. The peculiar disgrace of the period lies in the fact that the condition of the empire was not hopeless at the time. With ordinary courage and prudence it might have been held together, for the attacks directed against it were not more formidable than others which had been beaten off with ease. If the blow had fallen when a hero like Leo III, or even a statesman like Alexius I, was on the throne, there is no reason to doubt that it would have been parried. But it fell in the times of 2 incompetent triflers, who conducted the state on the principle of, "Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die." Isaac and Alexius felt in themselves no power of redeeming the empire from the evil day, and resignedly fell back on personal enjoyment. Isaac's taste lay in the direction of gorgeous raiment and the collecting of miraculous icons. Alexius preferred the pleasures of the table. Considered as sovereigns there was little to choose between them. Each was competent to ruin an empire already verging on its decline. The disaster which the Angeli brought on their realm was rendered possible only by its complete military and financial disorganization. As a military power the empire had never recovered the effects of the Seljuk invasions, which had robbed it of its greatest recruiting ground for its native troops in Asia Minor. After that loss the use of mercenaries had become more and more prevalent. The brilliant campaigns of Manuel Comnenus had been made at the head of a soldiery of whom 2/3 were not born subjects of the empire. He, it is true, had kept them within the bounds of strict discipline, and contrived at all costs to provide their pay. But the weak and thriftless Angeli were able neither to find money nor to maintain discipline. A state which relies for its defence on foreign mercenaries is ruined, if it allows them to grow disorderly and inefficient. In times of stress they mutiny instead of fighting. The civil administration was in almost as deplorable a condition, while those two "earthly angels," as a contemporary chronicler called them, were charged with its care. Isaac Angelus put the finishing touch to the administrative abuses, which had already been rife enough under the Comneni, by exposing offices and posts to auction. Instead of paying his officials he "sent them forth without purse or scrip, like the apostles of old, to make what profit they could by extortion from the provincials." His brother Alexius promised on his accession to make all appointments on the ground of merit, but proved in reality as bad as Isaac. He was surrounded by a ring of rapacious favourites, who managed all patronage, and dispensed it in return for bribes. When high posts were not sold, they were given as douceurs to men of local influence, whose rebellion was dreaded. The history of the 20 years covered by the reigns of the two Angeli is cut into two equal halves at the deposition of Isaac by his brother in 1195. It is only necessary to point out how the responsibility for the disasters of the period is to be divided between them. Isaac's share consists of the loss of Bulgaria and Cyprus. The former country had now been in the hands of the Byzantines for nearly 200 years, since its conquest by Basil II. But the Bulgarians had not merged in the general body of the subjects of the empire. They preserved their national language and customs, and never forgot their ancient independence. In 1187, 3 brothers named Peter, John, and Azan stirred up rebellion among them. If firmly treated it might have been crushed with ease by the regular troops of the empire. But Isaac first appointed incompetent generals, who let the rebellion grow to a head, and when at last he placed an able officer, Alexis Brannus, in command, his lieutenant took the opportunity of using his army for revolt. Brannus marched against Constantinople, and would have taken it, had not Isaac committed the charge of the troops that remained faithful to him to stronger hands than his own. He bribed an able adventurer from the west, Conrad, Marquis of Montferrat, by the offer of his sister's hand and a great sum of money to become his saviour. The gallant Lombard routed the forces of Brannus, slew the usurper, and preserved the throne for his brother-in-law. But while the civil war was going on, the Bulgarians were left unchecked, and made such head that there was no longer much apparent chance of subduing them. Isaac took the field against them in person, only to see the great towns of Naissus, Sofia, and Varna taken before his eyes. While a national revolt deprived the Emperor of Bulgaria, Cyprus was lost to a meaner force. Isaac Comnenus, a distant relative of the Emperor Manuel II., raised rebellion among the Cypriots and defeated the fleet and army which his namesake of Constantinople sent against him. He held out for 6 years, and appeared likely to establish a permanent kingdom in the island. This revolt was of the worst augury to the empire. It had often lost provinces by the invasion of barbarian hordes, or the rebellion of subject nationalities. But that a native rebel should sever a civilized Greek province from the empire, and reign as Emperor of Cyprus, was a new phenomenon. By the imperial theory the idea of an independent Empire of Cyprus was wholly monstrous and abnormal. The successful rebellion of Isaac Comnenus pointed to the possibility of a general breaking up of the Byzantine dominion into fragments, a danger that had never appeared before. Till now the provinces had always obeyed the capital, and no instance had been known of a rebel maintaining himself by any other way than the capture of Constantinople. Isaac Comnenus might, however, have founded a dynasty in Cyprus, if he had not quarrelled with Richard Coeur de Lion, the crusading king of England. When he maltreated some shipwrecked English crews, Richard punished him by landing his army in Cyprus and seizing the whole island. Isaac was thrown into a dungeon, and the English king gave his dominions to Guy of Lusignan, who called in Frank adventurers to settle up the land, and made it into a feudal kingdom of the usual Western type. While Isaac II. was in the midst of his Bulgarian war, and misconducting it with his usual fatuity, he was suddenly dethroned by a palace intrigue. His own brother, Alexius Angelus, had hatched a plot against him, which worked so successfully that Isaac was caught, blinded, and immured in a monastery long before his adherents knew that he was in danger. Alexius III. never showed any other proof of energy save this skilful coup d'état aimed against his brother. He continued the Bulgarian war with the same ill success that had attended Isaac's dealings with it. He plunged into a disastrous struggle with the Seljuk Sultan of Iconium, and he quarrelled with the Emperor Henry VI., who would certainly have invaded his dominions if death had not intervened to prevent it. But as long as Alexius was permitted to enjoy the pleasures of the table in his villas on the Bosphorus, the ill success abroad of his arms and his diplomacy vexed him but little. But in 1203, a new and unexpected danger arose to scare him from his feasting. His blind brother Isaac had a young son named Alexius, who escaped from Constantinople to Italy, and took refuge with Philip of Swabia, the new emperor of the West. Philip had married a daughter of Isaac Angelus, and determined to do something to help his young brother-in-law. The opportunity was not hard to seek. Just at this moment a large body of French, Flemish, and Italian crusaders, who had taken arms at the command of the Pope, were lying idle at Venice. They had marched down to the great Italian seaport with the intention of directing a blow against Malek Adel, Sultan of Egypt. The Venetians had contracted to supply them with vessels for the crusade, but for reasons of their own had determined that the attack should not fall on the shore for which it had been destined. They were on very good terms with the Egyptian sovereign, who had granted them valuable commercial privileges at Alexandria, which threw the whole trade of the distant realms of India into Venetian hands. Accordingly they had determined to avert the blow from Egypt and turn it against some other enemy of Christendom. The leaders of the Fourth Crusade proved unable to pay the full sum which they had contracted to give the Venetians as ship hire, and this was made an excuse for keeping them camped on the unhealthy islands of the lagoons till their patience and their stores were like exhausted. Henry Dandolo, the aged but wily doge, then proposed to the Crusaders that they should pay their way by doing something in aid of Venice. The Dalmatian town of Zara had lately revolted and done homage to the King of Hungary. If the Crusaders would recover it, the Venetian state would wipe out their debts and transport them whither they wished to go. the Crusaders had taken arms for a holy war against the Moslems. They were now invited to turn aside against a Christian town and interest themselves in Venetian politics. Conscientious men would have refused to join in such an unholy bargain, and would have insisted in carrying out their original purpose against Egypt. But conscientious men had been growing more and more rare among the Crusaders for the last 100 years. There were as many greedy military adventurers among them as single-hearted pilgrims. The more scrupulous chiefs were over-persuaded by their designing companions, and the expedition against Zara was undertaken. Zara fell, but another and more important enterprise was then placed before the Crusaders. While they wintered on the Dalmatian coast the young Alexius Angelus appeared in their camp, escorted by the ambassadors of his brother-in-law, the Emperor Philip of Swabia. The exiled prince besought them to turn aside once more before they sailed to the east, and to rescue his blind father from the dungeon into which he had been cast by his cruel brother Alexius III. If they would drive out the usurper and restore the rightful ruler to his throne, they should have anything that the Byzantine Empire could afford to help them for their crusade: money in plenty, stores, a war fleet, a force of mercenary troops, and his own presence as a helper in the war with Egypt. Pope Innocent III had already been storming at the adventurers for shedding Christian blood at Zara, and tampering with their crusaders' oath. But the prospect of Byzantine gold seduced the needy western barons, and the desire of keeping the war away from Egypt ruled the minds of the Venetians. They hesitated and began to treat with Alexius, though they knew that thereby they were calling down on themselves the terrors of a papal excommunication. All now depended on the leaders, and among them the abler minds were set on the acceptance of the proposal of the young Byzantine exile. The three chiefs of the Crusade were the Doge Henry Dandolo, Boniface Marquis of Montferrat, and Baldwin Count of Flanders. In Dandolo the ruthless energy of the Italian republics stood incarnate. He was the one man in the crusading army who knew exactly what he wanted. Old and blind, but clear-headed and inflexible, he was set on revenging an ancient grudge against the Greeks, and on furthering, by any means, good or evil, the fortunes of his native city. Baldwin and Boniface, the two secondary figures in the camp of the Franks, are perfect representations of the two types of crusader. The Fleming, gallant and generous, pious and debonair, worthy of a more righteous enterprise and a more honourable death, was a true successor of Godfrey of Bouillon, and the heroes of the first Crusade. The Lombard, a deep and hardy schemer, to whom force and fraud seemed equally good, was simply seeking for wealth and fame in the realms of the East. He cared little for the Holy Sepulchre, and much for his own private advancement. Behind these three leaders we descry the motley crowd of the feudal world: relic-hunting abbots in coats of mail, wrangling barons and penniless knights, the half-piratical seamen of Venice, and the brutal soldiery of the West. Boniface of Montferrat and Doge Dandolo gradually talked over the more scrupulous Baldwin and his friends, and the crusading fleet was launched against Constantinople, after a treaty had been signed which bound Alexius Angelus and his blind father, Isaac II, to pay the Crusaders 200,000 marks of silver, send 10,000 men to Palestine, and acknowledge the supremacy of the Pope over the Eastern Church. In these conditions lay the germs of much future trouble. The crusading armament reached the Dardanelles without having to strike a blow. The slothful and luxurious emperor let things slide, and had not even a fleet ready to send against them in the Aegean. He shut himself up in Constantinople, and trusted to the strength of its walls to deliver him, as Heraclius and Leo III and many more of his predecessors had been delivered. If the siege had been conducted from the land side only, his hopes might have been justified, for the Danes and English of the Varangian Guard beat back the assault of the Franks on the land wall. But Alexius III, unlike earlier emperors, was attacked by a fleet to which he could oppose no adequate naval resistance. Though the Crusaders were driven off on shore, the Venetians stormed the sea wall, by the expedient of building light towers on the decks, and throwing flying bridges from the towers on to the top of the Byzantine ramparts. The blind Doge pushed his galley close under the wall, and urged on his men again and again till they had won a lodgment in some towers on the port side of the sea wall. The Venetians then fired the city, and a fearful conflagration followed. Hearing that the enemy was within the ramparts, the cowardly Alexius III mounted his horse and fled away into the inland of Thrace, leaving his troops, who were not yet half beaten, without a leader or a cause to fight for. The garrison bowed to necessity, and the chief officers of the army drew the aged Isaac II out of his cloister prison and proclaimed his restoration to the throne. They sent to the crusading camp to announce that hostilities had ceased, and to beg Prince Alexius to enter the city and join his father in the palace. The end of the expedition of the Crusaders had now been attained, but it may safely be asserted that the chief feeling in their ranks was a bitter disappointment at being cheated out of the sack of Constantinople, a prospect over which they had been gloating ever since they left Zara. They spent the next 3 months in endeavouring to wring out of their triumphant protégés, Isaac and Alexius, every bezant that could be scraped together. The old emperor, already blind and gout-ridden, was driven to imbecility by their demands; his son was a raw, inexperienced youth who could neither be firm, nor frank, nor dignified in dealing with any one. He angered the Franks by insincere diplomacy, and the Greeks by his reckless schemes for extracting money from them. The winter of 1203–4 was spent in ceaseless wrangling about the subsidy due to the Crusaders, till Alexius, growing seriously frightened, began exactions on his subjects which drove them to revolt. When he seized and melted down the golden lamps and silver candelabra which formed the pride of Saint Sophia, stripped its iconostasis of its rich metal plating, and requisitioned the jewelled icons and reliquaries of every church in the city, the populace would stand his proceedings no longer. They would not serve an emperor who sold himself to the Franks, and only reigned in order to subject the Eastern Church to Rome, and to pour the hoarded wealth of the ancient empire into the coffers of the upstart Italian republics. In January, 1204, the storm burst. The populace and troops shut the gates of the city, and fell on the isolated Latins who were within the walls. They were not long without a leader. A fierce and unscrupulous officer named Alexius Ducas put himself at their head and determined to seize the throne. Isaac II died of fright in the midst of the tumult. His son Alexius was caught and strangled by the usurper. Thus the Angeli ceased out of the land, and Alexius V reigned in their stead. He is less frequently named by chroniclers under his family name of Ducas, than under his nickname of Murtzuphlus, drawn from the bushy overhanging eyebrows which formed the most prominent feature of his countenance. Alexius Ducas had everything against him. He was a mere usurper, whose authority was hardly recognized beyond the walls of Constantinople. The Angeli had so drained the treasury that nothing remained in it. 20 years of indiscipline and disaster had spoilt the army. The fleet was non-existent, for the admirals of Alexius Angelus had laid up the vessels in ordinary, and sold the stores to fill their own pockets. Nevertheless Murtzuphlus made a far better fight than his despicable predecessor and namesake. He collected a little money by confiscating the properties of the unpopular courtiers and ministers of the Angeli, and used it to the best advantage. The army received some of the arrears due them, and Alexius spent every spare moment in seeing to their drill and endeavouring to improve their discipline. He strengthened the sea wall, whose weakness had been proved so fatally 4 months ago, by erecting wooden towers along it, and building platforms for all the military engines that could be found in the arsenal. He ordered, too, the enrolment of a national militia, and compelled the nobles and burghers of Constantinople to take arms and man the walls. To the discredit of the Byzantines this order was received with many murmurs. The citizens complained that they paid taxes to support the regular army, and that they therefore ought to be excused personal service. Little good was got out of these new and raw levies. They swelled the numbers of the garrison, but hardly added anything appreciable to its strength. Alexius Ducas himself with his cavalry scoured the country round the crusading camp every day, to cut off the foraging parties of the Franks, and when not in the field, rode round the city superintending the works, inspecting the guard posts, and haranguing the soldiery. If courage and energy command success, he ought to have held his own. But he could not counteract the work of 20 years of decay and disorganization, and felt that his throne rested on the most fragile of foundations. The Crusaders took 2 months to prepare for their second assault on Constantinople, which they felt would be a far more formidable affair than the attack in the preceding autumn. They directed their chief efforts against the sea wall, which they had found vulnerable in the previous siege, and left the formidable land wall alone. The ships were told off into groups, each destined to attack a particular section of the wall, and covered with as many military engines as they could carry. Flying bridges were again prepared, and landing parties were directed to leap ashore on the narrow beach between the wall and the water, and to get to work with rams and scaling ladders. The attack was made on April 8th, at more than 100 points along 2 miles of sea wall, but it was beaten off with loss. Alexius Ducas had made his arrangements so well, that the fire of his engines swept off all who attempted to gain a footing on the ramparts. The ships were much damaged, and at noon the whole fleet gave back, and retired as best it could to the opposite side of the Golden Horn. Many of the Crusaders were now for returning. They thought their defeat was a judgment for turning their arms against a Christian city, and wished to sail for the Holy Land. But Dandolo and the Venetians insisted upon repeating the assault. 3 days were spent in repairing the fleet, and on April 12th a second attack was delivered. This time the ships were lashed together in pairs to secure stability, and the attack was concentrated on a comparatively small front of wall. At last, after much fighting, the military engines of the fleet and the bolts of its crossbowmen cleared a single tower of its defenders. A bridge was successfully lowered on to it, and a footing secured by a party of Crusaders, who then threw open a postern gate and let the main body in. After a short fight within the walls, the troops of Alexius Ducas retired back into the streets. The Crusaders fired the city to cover their advance, and by night were in possession of the northwest angle of Constantinople, the quarter of the palace of Blachern. While the fire was keeping the combatants apart, the emperor tried to rally his troops and to prepare for a street fight the next day. But the army was cowed; many regiments melted away; and the Varangian Guard, the best corps in the garrison, chose this moment to demand that their arrears of pay should be liquidated. They would not return to the fight without their money. The 20 years of disorganization under the Angeli was now bearing its fruit, and deeply was the empire to rue the next day. Alexius Ducas, in despair at being unable to make his men fight, left the city by night. He was soon followed by the last Greek officer who kept his head, the general Theodore Lascaris, who endeavored to make one final attack on the Crusaders even after his master had departed. Next morning the Franks found themselves in full possession of the city, though they had been expecting to face a hard day of street fighting before this end could be attained. In cold blood, 12 hours after all fighting had ended, the Crusaders proceeded with great deliberation to sack the place. The leaders could not or would not hold back their men, and every atrocity that attends the storm of a great city was soon in full swing. Though no resistance was made, the soldiery, and especially the Venetians, took life recklessly, and 3,000 or 4,000 unarmed citizens were slain. But there was no general massacre; it was lust and greed rather than bloodthirstiness that the army displayed. All the Western writers, no less than the Greeks, testify to the horrors of the 3 days' carnival of rape and plunder that now set in. Every knight or soldier seized on the house that he liked best, and dealt as he chose with its inmates. Churches and nunneries fared no better than private dwellings. The orgies that were enacted in the holiest places caused even the Pope to exclaim that no good could ever come out of the conquest. The drunken soldiery enthroned a harlot in the patriarchal chair in St. Sophia, and made her rehearse ribald songs and indecent dances before the high altar. There were plenty of clergy with the crusading army, but instead of endeavoring to check the sacrilegious doings of their countrymen, they devoted themselves to plundering the treasuries of the churches of all the holy bones and relics that were stored in them. The Franks, remarked a Greek writer who saw the sack of Constantinople, behaved far worse than Saracens. The infidels when a town has surrendered at any rate respect churches and women. After private plunder had reigned unchecked for 3 days, the leaders of the Crusaders collected such valuables as could be found for public division. Though so much had been stolen and concealed, they were able to produce no less than 800,000 British pounds in hard gold and silver for distribution. The sum was afterwards supplemented by the use of a resource which makes the modern historian add a special curse of his own to the account of the Crusaders. Down to 1204 Constantinople still contained the monuments of ancient Greek art in enormous numbers. In spite of the wear and tear of 900 years, her squares and palaces were still crowded with the art treasures that Constantine and his sons had stored up. Nicetas, who was an eyewitness of all, has left us the list of the chief statues that suffered. The Heracles of Lysippus, the great Hera of Samos, the brass figures which Augustus set up after Actium, the ancient Roman bronze of the wolf with Romulus and Remus, Paris with the golden apple, Helen of Troy, and dozens more all went into the melting pot, to be recast into wretched copper money. The monuments of Christian art fared no better. The tombs of the emperors were carefully stripped of everything in metal, the altars and screens of the churches scraped to the stone. Everything was left bare and desolate. Such was the greatest conquest that was ever seen, greater than any made by Alexander or Charlemagne, or by any that have lived before or after, as a Western chronicler wrote, while the Greeks grew hyperbolical in lamentation, as they saw the eye of the world, the ornament of nations, the fairest sight on earth, the mother of churches, the spring whence flowed the waters of faith, the mistress of orthodox doctrine, the seat of the sciences, draining the cup mixed for her by the hand of the Almighty, and consumed by fires as devouring as those which ruined the 5 cities of the plain. At last the Crusaders sat down to divide up their conquests. they elected Baldwin of Flanders Emperor of the East, and handed over to him the ruined city of Constantinople, half of it devoured by the flames of the conflagrations that attended the two sieges, and all of it plundered from cellar to attic. 4/5 of the population had fled, and no one had remained save beggars who had nothing to save by flight. With the capital Baldwin was given Thrace and the Asiatic provinces, Bithynia, Mysia, and Lydia, all of which had still to be conquered. His colleague, Boniface of Montferrat, was made King of Thessalonica, and did homage to Baldwin for a fief consisting of Macedonia, Thessaly, and inland Epirus. The Venetians claimed a quarter and half a quarter of the empire, and took out their share by receiving Crete, the Ionian Islands, the ports along the west coast of Greece and Albania, nearly the whole of the islands of the Aegean, and the land about the entrance of the Dardanelles. They seized on every good harbour and strong sea fortress, but left the inland alone. Commerce rather than annexation was their end. The rest of the empire was parcelled out among the minor leaders of the Crusade. They had first to conquer their fiefs, and were then to do homage for them to the Emperor Baldwin. Most of them never lived to accomplish the scheme. Meanwhile a Venetian prelate was appointed Patriarch of Constantinople, and news was sent to the Pope that the union of the Eastern and Western churches was accomplished, by the forcible extinction of the Greek Patriarchate. It only remains to speak of Alexius Ducas, the fugitive Greek emperor. He fell into the hands of the Crusaders, was tried for the murder of the young Alexius Angelus, and suffered death by being taken to the top of a lofty pillar and hurled from it. The Greeks saw in this strange end the fulfilment of an obscure prophecy about the last of the Caesars, which had long puzzled the brains of the oracle mongers. Chapter 22. Chapter 23 of the Byzantine Empire. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Byzantine Empire, by Charles William Chadwick Oman. Chapter 23, The Latin Empire and the Empire of Nicaea, 1204 to 1261. Seldom has any state dragged out 57 years in such constant misery and danger as the Latin Empire experienced in the course of its inglorious existence. The whole period was one of protracted death agony, and at no date within it did there appear any reasonable prospect of recovery. 30,000 men can take a city, but they cannot subdue a realm 800 miles long and 400 broad. Far more than any government which has since held sway on the same spot did the Latin Empire of Romania deserve the name of the sick man. It is not too much to say that but for the unequalled strength of the walls of Constantinople the new power must have ceased to exist within 10 years of its establishment. But, once fortified within the ramparts of Byzantium, the Franks enjoyed the inestimable advantage which their Greek predecessors had possessed. They were masters of a fortress which, as military science then stood, was practically impregnable, if only it was defended with ordinary skill, and adequately guarded on the front facing the sea. As long as the Venetians kept up their naval supremacy in eastern waters, the city was safe on that side, and even the very limited force which the Latin emperor could put into the field sufficed, when joined to the armed burghers of the Italian quarters, to defend the tremendous land wall. From the first year of its existence the Latin Empire was marked out by unfailing signs as a power not destined to continue. the intention of its founders had been to replace the centralized despotism which they had overthrown by a great feudal state, corresponding in territorial extent to its predecessor. But within a few months it became evident that the conquest of the broad provinces which the Crusaders had distributed among themselves by anticipation, was not to be carried out. The new emperor himself was the first to discover this. He set out with his chivalry to drive from northern Thrace the Bulgarian hordes, who had flocked down into the plains to profit by the plunder of the dismembered realm. But near Adrianople he met Joannicios, the Bulgarian king, with a vast army at his back. The Franks charged gallantly enough, but they were simply overwhelmed by numbers. The larger part of the army was cut to pieces, and Baldwin himself was taken prisoner. The Bulgarian kept him in chains for some months, and then put him to death, after he had worn the imperial crown for only 1 year. 1205. Henry of Flanders, the brother of Baldwin, became his successor. He was an honest and able man, but he could do nothing towards conquering the provinces of Asia, pushing the Bulgarians back over the Balkans, or conciliating the subject Greek population. All his reign he had to fight on the defensive against his neighbours to the north and south. By the time that he died the empire was practically confined to a narrow slip of land along the Propontis, reaching from Gallipoli to Constantinople. Nor was the chief of the minor Latin states any better off. Boniface of Montferrat had fallen in 1207, slain in battle by the same Bulgarian hordes which had cut off the army of his suzerain Baldwin. With his death it became evident that the kingdom of Thessalonica was no more able to conquer all the old Byzantine provinces in its neighbourhood than was the empire of Constantinople. Boniface's son and heir was a mere infant. During his minority the lands of his kingdom were lopped away, one after another, by the Greek despot of Epirus, the able Theodore Angelus. At last the capital itself was retaken by the Greeks in 1222, and the kingdom of Thessalonica came to an end. The Latin states in the southern parts of the Balkan peninsula fared somewhat better. William of Champlitte had contrived to hew out for himself a principality in the western parts of the Peloponnesus, and had organized there a small state with 12 baronies and 136 knights' fees. The resistance of the natives in this district was particularly weak, and one battle sufficed to give William all the coast plain of Elis and Messenia. Yet he did not succeed in subduing the mountaineers of the peninsula of Maina, or the coast towns of Argolis and Laconia, so that the Greeks still had some foothold in the peninsula. Another small Latin state was set up by Otho de la Roche in central Greece, where as Duke of Athens he ruled Attica and Boeotia. He treated his Greek subjects with more consideration than any of his fellow crusaders, and was rewarded by obtaining a degree of respect and deference which was not found in any other Latin state. Though the smallest, the Duchy of Athens was undoubtedly the most prosperous of the new creations of the conquest of 1204. Meanwhile it is time to speak of the fortunes of those parts of the Eastern Empire which the Franks did not succeed in seizing when Constantinople fell. The provinces had hitherto been accustomed to accept without a murmur the ruler whom the capital obeyed. But in 1204 it was found that the centralization of the Byzantine Empire, great as it was, had not so thoroughly crushed the individuality of the provinces as to make them submit without resistance to the Latin yoke. Whenever the provincials found a leader, whether a member of one of the ex-imperial houses, or an energetic governor, or a landholder of local influence, they stood up to defend themselves. The Byzantine Empire, like some creature of low organism, showed every sign of life in its limbs, though its head had been shorn off. Wherever a centre of resistance could be found the people refused to submit to the piratical Frank, and to his yet more hated companions the priests of the Roman Church. Of the 9 or 10 leaders who put themselves at the head of provincial risings 3 were destined to carve out kingdoms for themselves. Of these the most important was Theodore Lascaris, the last officer who had attempted to strike a blow against the Franks when Constantinople fell. He might claim some shadow of hereditary right to the imperial crown as he had married the daughter of the imbecile Alexius III, but his true title was his well-approved courage and energy. The wrecks of the old Byzantine army rallied around him, the cities of Bithynia opened their gates, and when the Latins crossed into Asia to divide up the land into baronies and knights' fees, they found Theodore waiting to receive them with the sword. His defence of the strong town of Prusa, which successfully repelled Henry of Flanders, put a limit to the extension of the Frank Empire. Beyond a few castles on the Bithynian coast they made no conquests. Having thus checked the invaders, Theodore had himself solemnly crowned at Nicaea, and assumed imperial state. 1206. Having beaten off the Latins, Theodore had to cope with another who aspired like himself to pose as the rightful heir to the imperial throne. Alexius Comnenus, a grandson of the wicked Emperor Andronicus I, had betaken himself to the eastern frontiers of the empire when Constantinople fell, and obtained possession of Trebizond and the long slip of coastland at the southeast corner of the Black Sea, from the mouth of the Phasis to Sinope. He aspired to conquer the whole of Byzantine Asia, and sent his brother David Comnenus to attack Bithynia. But Theodore defended his newly won realm with success. Comnenus gained no territory from him, and was constrained to content himself with the narrow bounds of his Pontic realm, where his descendants reigned in obscurity for 300 years as emperors of Trebizond. A greater danger beset the empire of Nicaea when the warlike Sultan of the Seljuks came down from his plateau to ravage its borders. But the valour of Theodore Lascaris triumphed over this enemy also. In the battle of Antioch on Meander he slew Sultan Kaikhosru with his own hand in single combat, and the Turks were beaten back with such slaughter that they left the empire alone for a generation. Meanwhile a third Greek state had sprung into existence in the far west. Michael Angelus, a cousin of Alexius III and Isaac II, put in a claim to their heritage, though he was disqualified by his illegitimate birth. He was recognized as ruler by the cities of Epirus, and proclaimed himself despot of that land. Raising an army among the warlike tribes of Albania, he maintained his position with success, and discomfited the Franks of Athens and Thessalonica when they took arms against him. He died early, but left a compact heritage to his brother Theodore, who succeeded him on the throne, and within a few years conquered the whole of the Frank kingdom of Thessalonica. It was soon evident that there would be a trial of strength between the 2 Greek emperors who claimed to succeed to the rights of the dispossessed Angeli. The Latin Empire was obviously destined to fall before one of them. The only doubt was, whether the Epirot or the Nicene was to be its conqueror. This question was not settled till 1241, when the 2 powers met in decisive conflict. By this time Theodore Lascaris had been succeeded in Asia by his son-in-law John Ducas, see footnote, and Theodore of Thessalonica by his son John Angelus. At Constantinople the succession of Latin emperors had been much more rapid. Henry of Flanders had died in 1216. He was followed by Peter of Courtenay, who was slain by the Epirots in less than a year. To him succeeded Robert his son, and when Robert died in 1228 his brother Baldwin II. Reigned in his stead. The young Courtenays were both thoroughly incapable, and saw their empire melt away from them till nothing was left beyond the walls of Constantinople itself. Footnote: Sometimes known as John Vatatzes. John III of Nicaea was an excellent sovereign, a very worthy heir to his gallant father-in-law. Not only was he a good soldier and an able administrator, but by constant supervision and strict frugality he had got the financial condition of his empire into a more hopeful condition, a state of things which had never been seen in Romania since the time of John Comnenus, 100 years before. In 1230 the troops of Nicaea crossed into Europe, and drove the Franks out of southern Thrace, while in 1235 John Ducas laid siege to Constantinople itself. But the time of its fall had not yet arrived, and when a Venetian fleet approached to succour it the emperor was constrained to raise the siege. Recognizing that Constantinople was not yet ripe for its fall, John Ducas resolved to measure himself with his rivals the Angeli of Thessalonica. He beat their forces out of the field, and laid siege to their capital in 1341. Then John Angelus engaged to resign the title of emperor, call himself no more than despot of Epirus, and to acknowledge himself as the vassal of the ruler of Nicaea. This satisfied Ducas for a time, but when Angelus died, 4 years later, he seized Thessalonica and united it to the imperial crown. The heir of the Angeli escaped to Albania and succeeded in retaining a small fraction only of his ancestral domains. 1246. John Ducas died in 1254, leaving the throne of Nicaea to his son Theodore II, who bid fair to continue the prosperous career of his father and grandfather. He drove the Bulgarians out of Macedonia, and penned the Albanians into their hills. But he became subject to epileptic fits, and died after a reign of only 4 years, before he had reached the age of 38. 1258. This was a dreadful misfortune for the empire, for John Ducas, the son and heir of Theodore, was a child of 8 years, and minorities were always disastrous to the state. We have seen in the history of previous centuries how frequently the infancy of a prince led to a violent contest for the place of regent, or even to a usurpation of the throne. The case of John IV. was no exception to the rule. The ministers of his father fought and intrigued to gain possession of the helm of affairs, till at last an able and unprincipled general, named Michael Palaeologus, thrust himself to the front, was named tutor to the emperor, and given the title of despot. Michael was as ambitious as he was unscrupulous. The place of regent was far from satisfying his ambition, and he determined to seize the throne, though he had steeped himself to the lips in oaths of loyalty to his young master. He played much the same game that Richard III. Was destined to repeat in England 2 centuries later. He cleared away from the capital the relatives and adherents of the little prince, placed creatures of his own in their places, and conciliated the clergy by large gifts and hypocritical piety. Presently the partisans of Michael began to declaim against the dangers of a minority, and the necessity for a strong hand at the helm. After much persuasion and mock reluctance the regent was induced to allow himself to be crowned. From that moment the boy John Ducas was thrust aside and ignored. Ere he had reached the age of 10 his wicked guardian put out his eyes and plunged him into a dungeon, where he spent 30 years in darkness and misery. The usurpation of Michael tempted all the enemies of the Greek Empire to take arms. The Epirot despot allied himself with the Frankish lords of Greece, and their united armies, aided by auxiliaries from Italy, invaded Macedonia. Moreover, the Latin Emperor of Constantinople stirred up the Venetians to ravage his neighbours' borders. But in 1260 the troops of Michael won, over the allied armies of the Franks and Epirots, the last great victory that a Byzantine army was ever destined to achieve. The field of Pelagonia decided the lot of the house of Palaeologus, for Michael's enemies were so crushed that they could never afterwards make head against him. Freed from all danger from the west, Michael was now able to turn against Constantinople, and complete the reconstruction of the empire. The city was ripe for its fall, and Baldwin of Courtenay had long been awaiting his doom. The long reign of the last Latin sovereign of Constantinople is sufficiently characterized by the fact that Baldwin spent nearly half the years of his rule outside the bounds of Romania, as he wandered from court to court in the west, striving to stir up some champion who would deliver him from the inevitable destruction impending over his realm. He gained little by his tours, his greatest success being that, in 1244, he got from St. Louis a considerable sum of ready money in acknowledgment of the liberality with which he had presented the Holy King with a choice selection of relics, including the rod of Moses, the jawbone of John the Baptist, and our Lord's crown of thorns. In 1261 Baldwin was in worse straits than ever. He was stripping off the lead of his own palace roof, to sell it for a few zecchins to the Venetians, and burning the beams of his outhouses in default of money to buy fuel. His son and heir was in pawn to the Venetian banking firm of the Capelli, who had taken him as the only tangible security that could be found for a modest loan which they had advanced to the imperial exchequer. With the government in such a desperate condition there was no longer any power of resistance left in Constantinople. When the Venetian fleet, the sole remaining defence of the empire, was away at sea, the city fell before a sudden and unpremeditated attack, made by Alexius Strategopulus, commander in Thrace under the Emperor Michael. Alexius, with 800 regular troops and a few score of half-armed volunteers, was admitted by treachery within the walls. Before this formidable array the heirs of the Crusaders fled in base dismay, and the empire of Romania came to an inglorious and a well-deserved end. Its monarch resumed his habitual mendicant tours in Western Europe, and never ceased to besiege the ears of popes and kings with demands for aid to recover his lost realm. At last Baldwin passed away. His sole memorial is the fact that he made a distressed and itinerant emperor in search of a champion, one of the stock figures in the romances of his day. No one in Western Europe was ignorant of his tale, and he survives as the prototype of the dispossessed sovereigns of 50 legends of chivalry. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of the Byzantine Empire. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Byzantine Empire, by Charles William Chadwick Oman. Chapter 24, Decline and Decay, 1261 to 1328. There was now once more a Byzantine Empire, and to an unobservant reader the history of the reigns of the Palaeologi looks like the natural continuation and sequel of the history of the reigns of Isaac Angelus and his brother. If the annals of Michael VIII and his son were written on to the end of that of Alexius Angelus, the intervening gap of the Latin conquest might almost pass unperceived, and the reader might imagine that he was investigating a single continuous course of events. The Frank dominion at Constantinople, and the heroic episode of the Empire of Nicaea, would pass equally unnoticed. We need not insist on the perniciousness of such a view. Great as may seem the similarity of the Byzantine Empire of 1204, and that of 1270, it had really suffered an entire transformation in that period. To commence by the most obvious and external sign of change, it will be observed that the lands subject to Michael Palaeologus were far more limited in extent than those which had obeyed Alexius Angelus. The loss in Asia was less than might have been expected. Theodore Lascaris and John Ducas had kept back the Turk, and only two districts of no great extent had fallen into Moslem hands: the Pisidian coast with the seaport of Adalia on the south, and the Paphlagonian coast with the seaport of Sinope on the north. Besides these, the distant Pontic province had now become the empire of Trebizond. In Europe the loss was far more serious. 4 great blocks of territory had been lost forever. The first was a slip along the southern slope of the Balkans, in northern Thrace and Macedonia, which had fallen into the hands of the Bulgarians, and had become completely Slavanized. The second was the district which is represented by the modern land of Albania. When the Angeli of Thessalonica fell before John Ducas, a younger member of the house retired to the original mountain house of the dynasty, and preserved the independence of the despotate of Epirus. Here the Angeli survived for some generations, maintaining themselves against the emperors of Constantinople by a strict alliance with the Latin princes of southern Greece. Next in the list of old Byzantine territories which Michael never recovered, we must place Greece proper, now divided between the Prince of Achaia, of the house of Villehardouin, and the Briennes, who had succeeded to the Duchy of Athens. But the Palaeologi still retained a considerable slice of the Peloponnesus, and were destined to encroach ere long on their Frankish neighbours. Lastly, we must mention the islands of the Aegean, of which the large majority were held either by the Venetian government, or by Venetian adventurers, who ruled as independent lords, but subordinated their policy to that of their native state. But the territorial difference between the empire of 1204 and the empire of 1261 was only one of the causes which crippled the realm of the Palaeologi. Bad though the internal government of the dominions of Alexius III had been, there was still then some hope of recovery. The old traditions of East Roman administrative economy, though neglected, were not lost, and might have been revived by an emperor who had a keen eye to discover ability and a ready hand to reward merit. New blood in the personnel of the ministry, and a keen supervision of details by the master's eye, would have produced an improvement in the state of the empire, though any permanent restoration of strength was probably made impossible by the deep-seated decay of society. But by the time of Michael Palaeologus even amelioration had become impossible. The 3 able emperors who reigned at Nicaea, though they had preserved their independence against Turk and Frank, had utterly failed in restoring administrative efficiency in their provinces. John Vatatzes, himself a thrifty monarch, who could even condescend to poultry farming to fill his modest exchequer, found that all his efforts to protect native industry could not cause the dried-up springs of prosperity to flow again. The whole fiscal and administrative machinery of government had been thrown hopelessly out of gear. It was the commercial decline of the empire that made a reform of the administration so hopeless. The Palaeologi were never able to reassert the old dominion over the seas which had made their predecessors the arbiters of the trade of Christendom. The wealth of the elder Byzantine Empire had arisen from the fact that Constantinople was the central emporium of the trade of the civilized world. All the caravan routes from Syria and Persia converged thither. Thither, too, had come by sea the commodities of Egypt and the Euxine. All the eastern products which Europe might require had to be sought in the storehouses of Constantinople, and for centuries the nations of the West had been contented to go thither for them. But the Crusades had shaken this monopoly, when they taught the Italians to seek the hitherto unknown parts of Syria and Egypt, and buy their Eastern merchandise from the producer and not from the middleman. Acre and Alexandria had already profited very largely at the expense of Constantinople ere the Byzantine Empire was upset in 1204. But the Latin conquest was the fatal blow. It threw the control of the trade of the Bosphorus into the hands of the Venetians, and the Venetians had no desire to make Constantinople their one central mart; they were just as ready to trade through the Syrian and Egyptian ports. To them the city was no more than an important halfway house for the Black Sea trade, and an emporium for the local produce of the countries round the Sea of Marmora. From 1204 onward Italy rather than Constantinople became the centre and starting place for all European trade, and the great Italian republics employed all their vigilance to prevent the Greek fleet from recovering its old strength. Henceforth the Byzantine war navy was insignificant, and without a war navy the Palaeologi could not drive away the intruders and restore the free navigation of the Levant to their own mercantile marine. The emperors who succeeded each other on the restored throne of Constantinople were, without exception, men more fitted to lose than to hold together an exhausted and impoverished empire. Their lot was cast, it is true, in hard times; but hardly one of them showed a spark of ability or courage in endeavouring to face the evil day. The three monarchs of the house of Lascaris who ruled at Nicaea had been keen soldiers and competent administrators, but with the return of the emperors to Constantinople the springs of energy began to dry up, and the gloom and decay of the ruined capital seemed to affect the spirit and brain of its rulers. Michael Palaeologus, though it was his fortune to recover the city which his abler predecessors had failed to take, was a mere wily intriguer, not a statesman or general. Having usurped the throne by the basest treachery towards his infant sovereign, he always feared for himself a similar fate. Suspicion and cruelty were his main characteristics, and in his care for his own person he quite forgot the interests of the state. Even contemporary chroniclers saw that he was deliberately setting himself to weaken the empire, because he dreaded the resentment of his subjects. He disbanded nearly all the native Greek troops, and refrained as far as possible from employing Greek generals. One of his minor acts in this direction may be said to have been the original circumstance which set the Ottoman Turks, the future bane of the empire, on their career of conquest. The borders of the empire in Asia were defended by native militia, who held their lands under condition of defending the castles and passes of the Bithynian and Phrygian mountains. The institution, which somewhat resembled a simple form of European feudalism, had worked so well that the Byzantine Empire had for a century and a half kept its Asiatic frontier practically intact, in spite of all the pressure of the Seljuk Turks of the Sultanate of Iconium. But the Bithynian militia were known to be attached to the house of Ducas, which Michael had dethroned, and he therefore resolved to disarm them. The measure was carried out, not without bloodshed, but the disbanded levy were not replaced by any adequate number of regular troops. Michael's financial straits did not permit him to keep under arms a very large force, such as was required to garrison his eastern line of forts after the abolition of the previous machinery of defence. 10 years only before Othman, the father of the Ottoman Turks, succeeded to the petty principality which was destined to be the nucleus of the Turkish Empire, the way for him had been thrown open by Michael's suspicious disarmament of the guards of his own frontier. Michael lived for 21 years after the recovery of Constantinople, but he did not win a single important advantage in all the rest of his reign. In Europe he barely held his own against the Bulgarians, the Franks, and the fleets of Genoa and Venice. The troubles which befell him at the hands of the two naval powers were largely of his own creation, for he shifted his alliance from one to the other with such levity and suddenness that both regarded him as unfriendly. Though all through his reign he was at war either with Genoa or Venice, yet such was the distrust felt for him that, when at war with one of the rivals, he could not always secure the help of the other. Venice had been the mainstay of the Frank emperors of Constantinople, and Michael might, therefore, have been expected to remain staunch to the Genoese. On the other hand, the Genoese had designs on the Black Sea trade, which touched the emperor's pocket very closely, while the Venetians were more connected with the distant commerce of Syria and Egypt, which did not concern him. Balancing one consideration with the other, Michael played false to both the powers, and often saw his coast ravaged and his small fleet compelled to take refuge in the Golden Horn, while the enemy's vessels swept the seas. On land he was less unlucky, and the Duke of Athens and the despot of Epirus were both kept in check, though neither of them were subdued. But it was in Asia that Michael's rule was most unfortunate. In the second half of his reign the Seljuks, though split into several principalities owing to the break-up of the Sultanate of Iconium, united to assail the borders of the empire. They conquered the Carian and Lydian inland, though Tralles and several other towns made a vigorous resistance, and reduced Michael's dominion in southwestern Asia Minor to a mere strip along the coast. A similar fate befell eastern Bithynia, where the Turks forced their way as far as the river Sangarius. But the ruin of Byzantine Asia was reserved to fall into the times of Michael's son and successor, Andronicus II. This prince had all the faults of his father, levity, perfidy, and cruelty, with others added from which Michael had been free: cowardice and superstition. The main interest which Andronicus took in life was concerned with things ecclesiastical; it would be wrong to say things religious; and he spent his life in making and unmaking patriarchs of Constantinople. No prelate could bear with him long, and in the course of his reign he deposed no less than 9 of them. While Andronicus was quarrelling with his patriarchs the empire was going to ruin. The Seljuk chiefs from the plateau of Asia Minor were pressing down more and more towards the coast, and making their way to the very gates of Ephesus and Smyrna. At last the emperor, growing seriously alarmed when the Turks appeared on the shores of the Propontis itself, and threatened the walls of Nicaea and Prusa, resolved to make an unwonted effort to beat them back. In 1302 the long war of the "Sicilian Vespers" between the houses of Anjou and Aragon came to an end, and the hordes of mercenaries of all nations which the two pretenders to the crown of Sicily had maintained were turned loose on the world. It occurred to Andronicus that he might hire enough of the veterans of the Sicilian war to enable him to beat back the Turks into their hills. All Europe acknowledged that they were the hardiest and best disciplined troops in Christendom, though they were also the most cruel and lawless. Accordingly the emperor applied to Roger de Flor, a renegade Templar, the commander of the mercenaries who had served Frederick of Aragon, and offered to take him into his service, with as many of his followers as could be induced to accompany him. Roger accepted with alacrity, and came to Constantinople in 1303 with 6,000 men at his back; other bodies were soon to follow. Andronicus loaded the "Grand Company," as Roger de Flor styled his men, with unlimited promises, and a certain amount of ready money. Roger himself was given the title of Grand Duke, and married to a lady of the imperial house. After clearing the Turks out of the Bithynian coastland the Grand Company spent the winter of 1303 4 in free quarters along the southern coast of Propontis. Their plundering habits and their arrogance soon brought them into ill odour with the inhabitants, who complained that they were well nigh as great a curse as the Turks. In the next year Roger moved south with his host, and drove the Turks out of Lydia and Caria; but instead of putting the Emperor into possession of the reconquered land, he garrisoned every fortress with his own men, and raised and appropriated the imperial taxes. There can be little doubt that he was plotting to seize the provinces he had regained, and to reign at Ephesus as an independent prince. At last Roger went so far as to lay formal siege to Philadelphia, because its inhabitants preferred to obey orders from Constantinople, and would not admit him within their gates. Andronicus then lured him to an interview at Adrianople, and in his very presence the great condottiere was assassinated by George the Alan, an officer whose son had been slain in a brawl by Roger's soldiers. The emperor had probably arranged the murder, and certainly refused to arrest its perpetrator. 1307. He was promptly punished. The Grand Company was not disorganized by the loss of its leader, and thought of nothing but revenge. Assembling themselves in haste, and abandoning Asia Minor to the Turks, they marched on Constantinople, harrying the land far and wide with fiendish cruelty. The emperor sent his son Michael against them, but the young prince was disgracefully beaten in 2 fights at Gallipoli and Apros, and the mercenaries spread themselves all over Thrace and plundered it up to the gates of the capital. It almost looked as if a second Latin conquest of Constantinople was about to take place, for the leaders of the Grand Company got succour from Europe, raised a corps of Turkish auxiliaries, and occupied Thrace for 2 years. But they could not storm the walls of Constantinople or Adrianople, and at last, after 2 years of plundering, they had stripped the country so bare that they were driven away by famine. Drifting southward and westward they ravaged Macedon and Thessaly, and at last reached Greece. Here they fell into a quarrel with Walter de Brienne, Duke of Athens, slew him in battle and took his capital. Then at last did the wandering horde settle down; they seized the duchy, divided its fiefs among themselves, and established a new dynasty on the Athenian throne. The empire was at last quit of them, for when once they ceased to wander the Grand Company ceased to be dangerous. This disastrous war with the mercenaries not only ruined Thrace and Macedonia, but was the cause of the final loss of the Byzantine provinces of Asia Minor. While Andronicus was feebly attempting to cope with the Grand Company, the Seljuk chiefs had conquered Lydia and Phrygia once more, and then advanced yet further north to siege Mysia and Bithynia. By 1325 they had reduced the emperor's dominions on the east of the straits to a narrow strip, reaching from the Dardanelles to the northern exit of the Bosphorus, and bounded by the Bithynian hills to the south. 5 Seljuk leaders had carved out for themselves principalities in the conquered districts: Menteshi in the south, Aidin and Sarokan in Lydia, Karazi in Mysia, and in the Bithynian borderland Othman, destined to a fame very different from that of his long forgotten compeers. While Othman and the rest were turning the once thickly peopled countries of Western Asia Minor into a desert sparsely inhabited by wandering nomads, Andronicus II was busied in a war even more uncalled for than that with the mercenaries. He wished to exclude from the succession to the throne his grandson and heir, who bore the same name as himself. But the younger Andronicus took measures to defend his rights, and raised armed bands. Grandfather and grandson were ere long engaged in a long but feebly conducted war, which was only terminated in 1328, when the old man acknowledged Andronicus the younger as his heir, and made him his colleague on the throne. But his grandson, not contented with this measure of success, made him retire from the conduct of affairs, and assumed control over every function of government. The name of Andronicus II. was still associated with that of Andronicus III. on the coinage and in the public prayers, but he took no further part in the rule of the empire. In 1332 he died, at a good old age, lamented by no single individual in the realm which he had ruled for 50 years. At his death the empire was only 2/3 of the size that it had been at his accession. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of the Byzantine Empire. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Byzantine Empire, by Charles William Chadwick Oman. Chapter 25. The Turks in Europe. Andronicus III. was a shade better than the incapable old man whom he supplanted. Though he was given, like all his house, to treachery and deceit, and through his life was loose and luxurious, he was at any rate active and energetic. He may be described as a weak reflection or copy of Manuel Comnenus, being a mighty hunter, a bold spear both in the tournament and on the battlefield, and a great spender of money. If he had not the brains to keep his empire together, he at any rate fought his best, and did not sit apathetically at home like his grandfather while everything was going to rack and ruin. Nevertheless, Andronicus III. was destined to see the termination of the process which had begun under Andronicus II. The entire loss of the Asiatic provinces of the empire to the Turks. It was now with the Ottomans almost exclusively that he had to deal. The other Seljuk hordes had no longer any marchland along the shrunken frontier of his dominions. These new foes of the empire deserve a word of description. Othman, the son of Ertugrul, was a vassal of the Seljuk Sultan of Raum, who had been granted a tract in the Phrygian highlands under the condition of military service against the Greeks. His fief lay in the northwest angle of the great central plateau of Asia Minor. Behind it lay the rolling country of hills and uplands already occupied by the Seljuks. Before it were the Bithynian mountains, with their passes protected by forts, and garrisoned by local militia, till the day when they were so perversely stripped of their defenders by the action of Michael Palaeologus. Othman, and his father Ertugrul before him, owned nothing in the hills, nor could they have pushed on if Michael had not made the way easy for them. But after 1270 the native militia was gone, and the followers of Othman, instead of having to face an armed population, fighting to protect its own fields, found to oppose them only inadequate garrisons of regular troops at long intervals. Othman's life covered two series of great events, the disastrous reign of Andronicus II. At Constantinople, and in Asia Minor the no less disastrous break-up of the power of his own suzerain, the Sultan of Raum. In 1294, Gaius Seddon, the last undisputed sovereign of the Seljuk line, fell in battle against rebels; and in 1307, Aladdin III., the last prince who claimed to be supreme sultan, died in exile. This made Othman an independent prince; but he did not take the title of sultan, contenting himself with the humbler name of emir. Othman's field of operation from 1281 to 1326 was the Byzantine borderland of Bithynia and Mysia. He was by no means the strongest of the Seljouk chiefs who made a lodgment within the borders of the empire, and it took him 20 years before he conquered one large town. His wild horsemen harried the open sea coast plain of Bithynia again and again, till at last the wretched inhabitants emigrated, or acknowledged him as their sovereign. But the towns, within their strong Roman walls, were unassailable by the light cavalry which formed his only armed strength. The siege of Prusa, the capital and key of the region, lasted 10 years. The Turks built a chain of forts around it and gradually made the introduction of provisions more and more difficult, till at last a large force was required to march out every time that a convoy was expected. At length the inhabitants could find no advantage in spending their whole lives in a beleaguered town undergoing slow starvation. Prusa surrendered in 1326, and Othman heard of the news on his deathbed. The Turkish frontier now once again touched the Sea of Marmora, which it had not reached since the Crusaders thrust it back inland in 1097. The reign of Othman's son Orkhan, the second emir of the Ottomans, almost coincided with that of Andronicus III. All that the one lost the other gained. Orkhan's life work was the completion of the conquest of Bithynia, which his father had begun. He took Nicomedia in 1327 and Nicaea in 1333, with all the surrounding territory, so that Andronicus retained nothing but Chalcedon and the district immediately facing Constantinople beyond the Bosphorus. Only once did he have to meet the emperor in pitched battle; this was at the fight of Pelikanon in 1329. Andronicus was wounded early in the day, and his army, deprived of its leader, went to pieces and was severely beaten. After his recovery from his wounds the emperor never faced the Ottomans again. After conquering Bithynia, Orkhan subdued his nearest neighbours among the other Seljouk emirs, and then turned to organizing his state. This was the date of the institution of his famous corps of the Janissaries, the first steady infantry that any Eastern power had ever possessed. He imposed on his Christian subjects in Mysia and Bithynia a tribute, not of money, but of male children. The boys were taken over while very young, placed in barracks, educated in the strictest and most fanatical Moslem code, and trained to the profession of arms. Having light horse enough and to spare, Orkhan taught the Janissaries to fight on foot with bow and sabre. They were well drilled, and moved in compact masses, which for many ages no foe proved competent to sunder and disperse. So thorough was the physical and moral discipline to which the Janissaries were subjected, that it was almost unknown for one of them to turn back from his career and relapse into Christianity. To keep them firm in their allegiance there acted not only the military and conventual discipline to which they were subject, but the dazzling prospect of future greatness. The Ottoman sovereigns made it their rule to select their generals and governors, their courtiers and personal attendants from the ranks of the tribute children. It was calculated that more than 2/3 of the Grand Viziers of Turkey, in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, had begun their career as Janissaries. The first generation of the new soldiery, for such is the meaning of the word Janissary, grew up to the military age during the latter half of the reign of Orkhan, and it was he who first utilized them on the European shore of the Bosphorus. Andronicus III died in 1241, and left his shrunken dominions to the risks of a minority, for his son and heir, John III, was only 9 years of age. If anything had been wanting to aid in the destruction of the empire, it was the arrival of such a contingency. The usual troubles soon set in, and the inevitable civil war was not far off. The evil spirit of the time was John Canticuzenus, the prime minister of the deceased emperor. He was a clever, shifty, intriguing courtier, with a turn for literature, but had the abilities neither of a general nor a statesman. However, he had read the tale of the rise of the Paleologi to some purpose, and had resolved to imitate the career of Michael VIII. Now, as in 1258, there was the best of chances for an unscrupulous minister to make himself first the colleague and then the supplanter of his young master. Cantacuzenus did his best to repeat the doings of Michael on Michael's great-great-grandson. He bribed and intrigued, made himself a party in the state, and prepared for a coup d'état when the time should be ripe. Unfortunately for himself, Cantacuzenus was not the stuff of which successful usurpers are made. He had his scruples and superstitions, and showed a fatal habit of procrastination which always led him to act a day too late. The Empress Dowager, Anne of Savoy, succeeded in raising a party against him, and when he threw off the mask and declared himself emperor he found himself unable to seize the capital, though he mustered an army under its walls. Finding that he was playing a losing game, Cantacuzenus took the usual step of calling in the national enemy to aid him. It was for the last time that this was done in Byzantine history, but never before had the result been so fatal. The usurper summoned to his aid first Stephen Dushan, the king of the Servians, and a little later the Turkish princes from across the Aegean, Orkhan the son of Othman, and his rival, Amauer, emir of Aden. These allies kept the cause of John Cantacuzenus from destruction, but it was by destroying the empire that John had coveted. King Stephen entered Macedonia and Thrace, and occupied the whole countryside, except Thessalonica and a few other towns. He then pushed further south, conquered Thessaly, and made the despot of Epirus do him homage. The Byzantine government retained little more than the capital, and the districts round Adrianople and Thessalonica. Most of this country was lost forever to the imperial crown, and it seemed as if a Servian domination in the Balkan peninsula was about to begin, for Stephen moved south from Servia, made Uscup in Macedonia his capital, and proclaimed himself Emperor of the Servians and Romans. It would perhaps have been well for Christendom if Stephen had actually conquered Constantinople and made an end of the empire. In that case there would have been a single great power in the Balkan peninsula, ready to meet the oncoming assault of the Turks. But Dushan was not strong enough to take the great city, and to the misfortune of Europe he died in 1355, leaving a realm extending from the Danube to the pass of Thermopylae. But his young son Urosh was soon assassinated, and the Servian Empire broke up as rapidly as it had grown together. A dozen princes were soon scrambling for the remnants of Stephen's heritage. The other allies whom John Cantacuzenus called in were the Turks Amauer and Orkhan, and on them he depended far more than on the Servian. He took over into Thrace a large body of Turkish horse, and allowed them to harry the countryside and carry away his subjects by thousands, to be sold in the slave markets of Smyrna and Brusa. But the depth of John's degradation was reached when he gave his daughter Theodora to Orkhan, to be immured in the Turk's harem. Thrace was rapidly assuming the aspect of a desert under the incursions of the Ottoman mercenaries of Cantacuzenus, when after 6 years of war the party of the Empress Anne consented to recognize the usurper as the colleague and guardian of the rightful heir. A hollow peace was patched up, and the two Johns could take stock of their dilapidated realm. 1347. The net result of their civil war had been that Macedonia and Thessaly were in Servian hands, and that Thrace was utterly ruined by the Turks. There was nothing left that could be called an empire. All that remained was Constantinople and Adrianople, the town of Thessalonica and the Byzantine province in the Peloponnesus. Cantacuzenus certainly deserves a notable place by the side of Isaac and Alexius Angelus, as the third of the great destroyers of the Eastern Empire. But his evil work was not yet done. For 7 years he ruled in conjunction with John Palaeologus, waging an unsuccessful war against Servia in the hopes of winning back Dushan's conquests. But in 1354 the young emperor, having attained the age of 24, resolved to assert himself, and took arms to dethrone his guardian. Cantacuzenus resisted, and sent over to Asia for the troops of his son-in-law Orkhan, who crossed into Thrace and drove the adherents of the Palaeologi out of several fortresses. But a night surprise from the side of the sea put John Palaeologus in possession of Constantinople, and by a fortunate chance he got Cantacuzenus himself into his hands. The usurper was, in accordance with the usual practice, tonsured and placed in a monastery. By exceptional good fortune he was spared the loss of his eyes, and was able to spend the remainder of his life in writing a history of his own time. But it was of little use to sweep away Cantacuzenus while Orkhan's Turks were in Thrace. The Ottomans had come as auxiliaries in the war, but they were resolved to stop as principals. Suleiman, the son of Orkhan, seized Gallipoli for himself, filled it with Turkish families, and made it a permanent settlement. This was the first Ottoman foothold in Europe. But it was not long to remain isolated. In 1359 Orkhan died, and his successor, Murad I, determined to cross over into Europe, and try the fortune of his arms. John Palaeologus was not a worse man than his immediate predecessors on the throne, but thanks to Cantacuzenus he had far less resources than even they had possessed. 2 years of fighting sufficed to put Thrace in the hands of Murad from sea to sea. A decisive battle in front of Adrianople in 1361 was the finishing stroke, and the empire became a mere head without a body. Its last home province had been lopped away, and beyond the walls of Constantinople no land acknowledged John V as sovereign save the district of Thessalonica and the Peloponnesus. Why Murad I did not finish the task he had begun, and take Constantinople itself, is hard to discern. Its walls were still formidable, and the Genoese and Venetians could still protect it on the side of the sea. But a siege pressed firmly to an end must at last have triumphed over the mere inert resistance of stone and mortar, unsupported by an adequate garrison within. However, Murad preferred to press on against worthier adversaries than the weak Palaeologus, and spent his life in incessant and successful wars with the Servians, the Bulgarians, and the Seljuk emirs of southern Asia Minor. In a reign of 30 years he extended his borders to the Balkans on the north, and annexed large tracts of Seljuk territory from his brother emirs in Asia Minor. John Palaeologus was his humble vassal and slave. After a vain attempt to get help from the Pope, this emperor without an empire resolved to make what terms he could, and rejoiced when he found that Murad was prepared to grant him peace. The Turk was a hard master, and rejoiced in giving his vassal unpalatable tasks. Best remembered among the tribulations of John is the siege of Philadelphia. That place had preserved a precarious independence after all the other cities of Byzantine Asia fell into the hands of the Turkish emirs. Being far away in the Lydian hills, it lost touch with Constantinople, and had become a free town. Murad, wishing to subdue it, compelled John V and his son Manuel to march in person against the last Christian stronghold in Asia. The emperor submitted to the degradation, and Philadelphia surrendered when it saw the imperial banner hoisted among the horsetails of the Turkish pashas above the camp of the besiegers. The humiliation of the empire could go no further than when the heir of Justinian and Basil Bulgaroctonos took the field at the behest of an upstart Turkish emir, in order to extinguish the last relics of freedom among his own compatriots. Chapter 26 of the Byzantine Empire. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Byzantine Empire, by Charles William Chadwick Oman. Chapter 26, The End of a Long Tale, 1370 to 1453. The tale of the last 75 years of the Byzantine Empire is a mere piece of local history, and no longer forms an important thread in the web of the history of Christendom. Murad the Turk might have taken Constantinople in 1370, without altering in any very great measure the course of events in Eastern Europe during the next century. For after 1370 the empire ceased to exercise its old function of bulwark of Christendom against the Ottomite. That duty now fell to the Servians and Hungarians, who continued to discharge it for the next 150 years. The Paleologi, by their base subservience to the Turk, protracted the life of the empire long after all justification for its existence had disappeared. If Constantinople had fallen in 1370, instead of 1453, there are only two ways in which European history would have been somewhat modified. The commercial resources of Genoa and Venice would have been straitened before the appointed time, and ere the Cape route to India enabled Europe to dispense with the use of Constantinople as halfway house to the East. And, we may add, the Renaissance would have been shorn of some of its brilliance in the next century, if the dispersion of the Greeks had taken place before Italy was quite fitted to receive them and turn their learning to account. But in other respects it is hard to see that much harm would have resulted from the fall of Constantinople in the end of the 14th rather than the middle of the 15th century. While Murad I was conquering the Servians and Bulgarians, John Paleologus was dragging out a long and unhonored old age. His reign was protracted for over half a century, but his later years were much vexed by the undutiful behavior of his children. His son Andronicus twice rebelled against him, and once succeeded in seizing the throne for a short space. Andronicus allied himself unto Saoudji, a son of Murad I, who plotted a similar treason against his father the emir. But Murad easily quelled the rebellion, put out the eyes of his own son, and sent Andronicus in chains to John II, bidding him to follow his example. The emperor did not dare to disobey, and ordered his son to be blinded. But the operation was so ineffectually performed that Andronicus retained a measure of sight, and was even able to venture on a second rebellion against his father. In consequence of his heir's unnatural conduct, the aged John determined to deprive him of his succession, and when he died in 1391, he left the throne to his second son Manuel, and not to his eldest born. Manuel II was above the average of the Paleologi, and showed some signs of capacity, but of what use was it to a prince whose sole dominions were Constantinople, Thessalonica, and the Peloponnesus? He had neither military strength nor money to justify rebellion against the Turk, and could only wait on the course of events. There was, however, one moment in Manuel's life at which the liberation of the empire from the Ottoman suzerainty appeared possible and even probable. In 1402, there burst into Asia Minor a great horde of Tartars, under the celebrated conqueror Tamerlane. Sultan Bayezid, the successor of Murad I., went forth to withstand the invader. But at Angora in Galatia, he suffered a crushing defeat, and the Ottoman Empire seemed likely to perish by the sword. Bayezid was captured, his trusty janissaries were cut to pieces, his light horsemen scattered to the winds. The Tartars swarmed all over Asia Minor, occupied Brusa, the Ottoman capital, and restored to their thrones all the Seljuk emirs whose dominions Murad I. had annexed. Bayezid died in captivity, and his sons began to fight over the remains of his empire. Prince Suleiman seized Adrianople, Prince Isa Nicaea, and each declared himself Sultan. This was a rare opportunity for Manuel Palaeologus. The thieves had fallen out, and the rightful owner might perchance come again to his own, if he played his cards well. The control of the Straits was of great importance to each of the Turkish pretenders, so much so, that Manuel was able to sell his aid to Suleiman for a heavy price. In order to keep Isa from crossing the water, the holder of the European half of the Ottoman realm ceded to the Emperor Thessalonica, the lower valley of the Strymon, the coast of Thessaly, and all the seaports of the Black Sea from the mouth of the Bosphorus up to Varna. For a moment Manuel once more ruled what might in courtesy be called an empire, and so long as the Ottomans were occupied in civil war he contrived to retain his gains. The strife of the sons of Bayezid lasted 10 years. Suleiman was slain by his brother Musa, Isa by his brother Mohammed, and the two supplanters continued the war. By all Oriental analogies their empire ought to have fallen to pieces, for it is very much easier to build up a new state in the East than to keep together an old one which is breaking asunder. But Mohammed, the youngest of the sons of Bayezid, was a man of genius. He triumphed over the last of his brothers, and united all the remnants of the Ottoman realm that remained. Much had been lost to the Seljuk emirs in Asia Minor, and to the Servians and Manuel Palaeologus in Europe, but the rest was back in Mohammed's hands by A.D. 1421. Manuel had very luckily cast in his lot with Mohammed during the later years of the Turkish civil war, and his ally let him enjoy the dominions he had recovered by his original treaty with Suleiman in 1403. Between 1402 and 1421, Europe had an unparalleled opportunity to rid herself of the Ottomans. Unfortunately it was not taken. Sigismund, King of Hungary, and at the same time Emperor, was the sovereign on whom the duty of leading the attack ought to have fallen. But Sigismund was now engaged in his great struggle with the Hussites in Bohemia. This wretched religious war directed the strength of Hungary northward when it was wanted in the south. Without such a power to back them the Servians, though they recovered their own liberty as a result of the battle of Angora, could do nothing towards driving the Turks from the Balkans. There was never any sympathy between Serb and Magyar, and save under the direct pressure of fear of a Moslem invasion they would not act together. The Hungarian kings had always laid claim to a suzerainty over the crown of Servia, and from time to time tried to convert their neighbours to Roman Catholicism by force of arms. Hence there was no love lost between them, and a crusade to expel the Turks was never concerted. Mahomet the Unifier died in 1421, and evil days at once set in for Constantinople and for Christendom, when his ambitious son Murad II came to the throne. Manuel Palaeologus was one of the first to feel the change in the times. He tried to make trouble for Murad. By supporting against him two claimants to the Ottoman Sultanate, each named Mustafa, one the uncle, the other the brother of the new ruler. This drew down on the empire the fate which had been delayed since 1370. The Sultan declared war on Manuel, took one after another all the fortresses which had been recovered by the peace of 1403, and finally laid siege to Constantinople. For the last time the walls of the city proved strong enough to repulse an assault. Though Murad levelled against them cannon, then seen for the first time in the East, built movable towers to shelter his troops, and launched his terrible janissaries to the assault, he could not succeed. The report of a miraculous vision of the Virgin, who vouchsafed to reveal herself as the defender of the city, encouraged the Greeks to resist with a better spirit than might have been expected. At last the pretender Mustapha, whom Manuel had supplied with money to cause a revolt against his brother, began to stir up such trouble in Asia Minor, that the Sultan determined to raise the siege and march against him. He granted Manuel peace, on the condition that he ceded all his dominions save the cities of Constantinople and Thessalonica and the Peloponnesian province. Thus the empire once more sank back into a state of vassalage to the Ottomans. 1422. Manuel II died 3 years after, at the age of 77. He was the last sovereign of Constantinople who won even a transient smile from fortune. The tale of the last 30 years of the empire is one of unredeemed gloom. To Manuel succeeded his son John VI, whose whole reign was passed in peace, without an attempt to shake off the Turkish yoke. Such an attempt indeed would have been hopeless, unless backed by aid from without. As Manuel II once observed, the empire now requires a bailiff, not a statesman to rule it. Treaties, wars, and alliances were not for him; all that he could do was try to save a little money, and to keep his walls in good repair, and even these humble tasks were not always feasible. All the descriptions of Constantinople in the 15th century, whether written by Greek natives or by Western travellers, bear witness to a state of exhaustion and debility which make us wonder that the empire did not collapse sooner. The country outside the walls was a desert. Within them more than half the ground was unoccupied, and covered only by ruins which testified to ancient magnificence. The great palace by the Augusteum, which sheltered so many generations of emperors, had grown so dilapidated that the Paleologi dwelt in a mere corner of it. Part of the porticos of St. Sophia had fallen down, and the Greeks could not afford to repair even the greatest sanctuary of their faith. The population of the city had shrunk to about 100,000 souls, most of them dwelling in great poverty. Such commerce and wealth as still survived in Constantinople had passed almost entirely into the hands of the Italians of Genoa and Venice, whose fortified factories at Galata and Pera now contained the bulk of the wares that passed through the city. The military strength of the empire was composed of about 4,000 mercenary troops, of whom many were Franks and hardly any were born subjects of the empire. The splendid court, which had once been the wonder of East and West, had shrunk to such modest dimensions that a Burgundian traveller noted with surprise that no more than 8 attendants accompanied the empress when she went in state to worship at St. Sophia. John VI, in spite of the caution with which he avoided all action, was destined to see the empire lose its most important possession beyond the walls of Constantinople. His brother Andronicus, governor of Thessalonica, traitorously sold that city to the Venetians for 50,000 zecchins. The Sultan, incensed at the transfer of Greek territory having taken place without his permission, pounced down on the place, expelled the Venetians and annexed Thessalonica to the Ottoman Empire. 1430. The chief feature of the reign of the last John Palaeologus was his attempt to win aid for the empire by enlisting sympathy in Western Europe. He determined to conform to Roman Catholicism and to throw himself on the generosity of the Pope. Accordingly he betook himself to Italy in 1438, with the Patriarch of Constantinople and many bishops in his train. He appeared at the councils of Ferrara and Florence, and was solemnly received into the Roman Church in the Florentine Duomo, on July 6, 1439. It had apparently escaped John's notice that Eugenius IV., the Pope of his own day, was a very different personage from the great pontiffs of the 11th and 12th centuries, who were able to depose sovereigns and send forth crusades at their good pleasure. Since the great schism the papacy had been hopelessly discredited in Christendom. Eugenius IV. was engaged in waging a defensive war against the Council of Basel, which was attempting to depose him, and had little thought or power to spend on aiding the Eastern Christians. All that John could get from him was a sum of money and a body of 300 mercenary troops. This was a poor return for his journey and conversion. Only one thing of importance was accomplished by the apostasy of the emperor: the outbreak of a venomous ecclesiastical struggle at Constantinople between the conformists who had taken the oath at Florence, and the bulk of the clergy, who disowned the treaty of union. John was practically boycotted by the majority of his subjects; the orthodox priests ceased to pray for him, and the populace refused to enter St. Sophia again, when it had been profaned by the celebration of the Roman Mass. The opinion of the majority of the Greeks was summed up in the exclamation of the Grand Duke John Notaras: "Better the turban of the Turk in Constantinople than the Pope's tiara." The last years of the reign of John VI. coincided with the great campaigns of Huniades and Ladislas of Poland against the Turks. For a moment it seemed as if the gallant King of Poland and Hungary, backed by his great Warden of the Marches, might restore the Balkan lands to Christendom. They thrust Murad II. back over the Balkans, and appeared in triumph at Sofia. But the fatal battle of Varna, 1444, ended the career of King Ladislas in an untimely death, and after that fight the Ottomans were obviously fated to accomplish their destiny without a check. John Palaeologus watched the struggle without movement if not without concern. He was too cautious to stir a finger to aid the Hungarians, for he knew that if he once offended the Sultan his days would be numbered. John VI. passed away in 1448, and Sultan Murad in 1451. The one was succeeded by his brother Constantine, the last Christian sovereign of Byzantium, the other by his young son Mohammed the Conqueror. Constantine was a Romanist like his elder brother, and was therefore treated with great suspicion and coolness by his handful of subjects. He was the best man that the house of Palaeologus had ever reared, brave, pious, generous, and forgiving. Like King Hosea of Israel, he did not evil as the kings that were before him, yet was destined to bear the penalty for all the sins and follies of his long line of predecessors. Mohammed II., the most commanding personality among the whole race of Ottoman sultans, set his heart from the first on seizing Constantinople, the natural centre of his empire, and making it his capital. Some excuse had to be found for falling on his vassal. The one that he chose was a rather unwise request which Constantine had made. There dwelt at Constantinople a Turkish prince of the royal house named Orkhan, for whom Mohammed paid a considerable subsidy, on the condition that he was kept out of the way of mischief and plotting. Some unhappy inspiration impelled Constantine to ask for an increase in the subsidy, and to hint that Orkhan had claims to the Sultanate. This was excuse enough for Mohammed. Without taking the trouble to declare war he sent out troops and engineers, and began to erect forts on Greek soil, only 4 miles away from Constantinople, at the narrowest point of the Bosphorus, so as to block the approach to the city from the Black Sea. The emperor did not dare to remonstrate, but when the Turks began to pull down a much venerated church, in order to utilize its stones in the new fort, a few Greeks took arms and drove the masons away. They were at once cut down by the Turkish guards. Constantine demanded redress, and then Mohammed, having fairly picked his wolf and lamb quarrel with his unfortunate vassal, commenced open hostilities. Autumn 1452. Turkish light troops at once appeared to blockade the city while the Sultan began to collect a great train of cannon at Adrianople, and to build a large fleet of war galleys in the ports of Asia. The siege was to begin in the ensuing spring. The empire was now in its death agony, and Constantine recognized the fact. He spent the winter in making frantic appeals to the Pope and the Italian naval powers to save him from destruction. Nicholas V was willing enough to help. Now that the emperor was a convert to Catholicism, something must be done to aid him. But all that the Pope could send was a cardinal, a moderate sum of money, and a few hundred soldiers of fortune hastily hired in Italy. Venice and Genoa could have done much more, but they had so often heard the cry of "Wolf" raised that they did not realize the danger to their eastern trade at its true extent. From Genoa, Giovanni Giustiniani brought no more than 2 galleys and 300 men. Venice did even less, only commissioning the bailiff of its factory at Galata to arm such able-bodied Venetians as were with him for the protection of the city. Altogether the Franks, counting both trained mercenaries and armed burghers, who cooperated in the defence of Constantinople, were not more than 3,000 strong. Yet either Genoa or Venice could have thrown 100 galleys and 20,000 men into the scale if they had chosen. Constantine's own troops were about 4,000 strong, but he hoped to recruit them by a general levy of the male population of the city. He issued a passionate appeal to his subjects to join in saving the Holy City, the centre of Eastern Christendom. But the Greeks only remembered that he was an apostate, who had forsworn the faith of his fathers and done homage to the Pope. They stood aside in sullen apathy, and from the whole population of the city only 2,000 volunteers were enlisted. Theological bitterness led the blind multitude to cry with Notaras that it preferred the Turk to the Roman. In April, 1453, the young Sultan, with 70,000 picked troops at his back, laid formal siege to the city on the land side, while a fleet of several hundred war galleys beset the Bosphorus. The end could not be for a moment doubtful. 9,000 men could not hope to defend the vast circuit of land and sea wall against a veteran army urged on by a young and fiery general. Mohammed set his cannon to play on the walls, and it was soon seen that the tough old Roman mortar and stone that had blunted the siege engines of so many foes could not resist the force of gunpowder. The Sultan's artillery was rude, but it was heavy and numerous. Ere long the walls began to come down in flakes, and breaches commenced to show themselves in several places. Constantine XIII and his second in command, the Genoese Giustiniani, did all that brave and skilful men might, in protracting the siege. They led sorties, organized attacks by water on the Turkish fleet, and endeavored to drive off the siege artillery of the enemy by a counter-fire of cannon. But it was found that the old walls were too narrow to bear the guns, and where any were hoisted up and brought to bear, their recoil shook the fabric in such a dangerous way that the fire was soon obliged to cease. At sea the Christians won one great success, when 4 galleys from the Aegean forced their way in through the whole Turkish fleet, and reached the Golden Horn in safety, after sinking many of their assailants. but the Turks had as great a numerical superiority on the water as on land, and the inevitable could only be delayed. Mohammed even succeeded in getting control of the harbour of the city, above its mouth, by dragging light galleys on rollers over the neck of land between the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn, and launching them in the inland waters just above Galata. Thus the inner, as well as the outer, sea face of the city was beset by enemies. The end came on May 29th, 1453. The Sultan had opened several practicable breaches, of which the chief lay in the northwest angle of the city by the gate of St. Romanus, where two whole towers and the curtain between them had been battered down and choked the ditch. The storm was obviously at hand, and the doomed emperor was obliged to face his fate. Greek historians dwelt with loving sorrow on the last hours of the unfortunate prince. He left the breach at midnight, partook of the sacrament according to the Latin rite in St. Sophia, and snatched a few hours of troubled sleep in his half-ruined palace. Next morning, with the dawn, he rose to ride back to the post of danger. His ministers and attendants crowded round his horse as he started on what all knew to be his last journey. Looking steadfastly on them he prayed one and all to pardon him for any offence that he might wittingly or unwittingly have committed against any man. The crowd answered with sobs and wails, and with the sounds of woe ringing in his ears Constantine rode slowly off to meet his death. The assault commenced at dawn. 3 main attacks and several secondary ones were directed against weak spots in the wall. But the chief stress was on the great breach by the gate of St. Romanus. There the emperor himself and Giustiniani at his side stood in the midst of the yawning gap with their best men around them, and opposed a barrier of steel to the oncoming assailants. 12,000 Janissaries, sabre in hand, formed successive columns of attack. As soon as one was beaten off another delivered its assault. They fell by hundreds before the swords of the mailed men in the breach, for their felt caps and unarmoured bodies were easy marks for the ponderous weapons of the 15th century. But the ranks of the defenders grew thin and weary. Giustiniani was wounded in the face by an arrow, and taken on board his galley to die. Constantine at last stood almost alone in the breach, and a forlorn hope of Janissaries headed by one Hassan of Ulubad, whom Turkish chroniclers delight to honour, at last forced their way over the wall. The emperor and his companions were trodden under foot, and the victorious army rushed into the desolate streets of Constantinople, seeking in vain for foes to fight. The Greeks, half expecting that God would interfere to save the queen of Christian cities by a miracle, had crowded into the churches, and were passing the fatal hour in frantic prayer. The shouts of the victorious enemy soon showed them how the day had gone, and the worshippers were dragged out in crowds, to be claimed as slaves and divided among the conquerors. Mohammed II rode through the breach after his men, and descended into the city, scanning from within the streets that so many Eastern conquerors had in vain desired to see. He bade his men search for the emperor, and the corpse of Constantine was found at last beneath a heap of slain, so gashed and mauled that it was only identified by the golden eagles on his mail shoes. The Turks struck off his head, and sent it round their chief cities as a token of triumph. Riding through the hippodrome towards St. Sophia, Mohammed noted the Delphic tripod with its 3 snakes, standing where Constantine the Great had placed it 1100 years before. Either because the menacing heads of the serpents provoked him, or merely because he wished to try the strength of his arm, the Sultan rose in his stirrups and smote away the jaws of the nearest snake with one blow of his mace. There was something typical in the deed though Mohammed knew it not. He had defaced the monument of the first great victory of the West over the East. He, the successor in spirit not only of Xerxes but of Chosroes and Moslema and many another Oriental potentate, who had failed where he succeeded, could not better signalize the end of Greek freedom than by dealing a scornful blow at that ancient memorial, erected in the first days of Grecian greatness, to celebrate the turning back of the Persians on the field of Plataea. At last the Sultan came to St. Sophia, where the crowd of wailing captives was being divided among his soldiery. He rode in at the eastern door, and bade a mullah ascend the pulpit and repeat there the formula of the Moslem faith. So the cry that God was great and Mohammed his prophet rang through the dome where 30 generations of patriarchs had celebrated the holy mysteries, and all Europe and Asia knew the end was come of the longest tale of empire that Christendom has yet seen. Finlay. End of chapter 26. End of the Byzantine Empire, by Charles William Chadwick Oman.